3 weeks after the Marines land on Guadalcanal, neither side has accepted the result. The Japanese want Henderson Field back. The Americans want to keep it. That arithmetic produces something specific in the waters east of the Solomon Islands. In late August 1942, to carrier fleets maneuvering toward each other across several hundred miles of open Pacific, while both sides understand that whoever loses their flight decks loses the ability to control the air over that contested jungle airstrip 300 meters away. The battle that follows on August 24th and 25th, 1942 carries the name Eastern Solomons. It does not get the historical weight of Midway or the Coral Sea. It lacks a single dramatic turning point clean enough for popular memory. What it has instead is the grinding probabilistic violence of carrier warfare. Aircraft launched from flight decks into weather that reduces visibility to miles. Pilots navigating by dead reckoning toward enemy ships they cannot yet see. Anti-aircraft gunners firing at dive bombers approaching from angles that give them less than 4 seconds of tracking time before the bomb releases. The Japanese plan feeding into this battle is direct. A convoy carrying roughly 1,500 soldiers toward Guadalcanal needs air cover to survive the approach. The carrier force built around the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, each displacing roughly 32,000 tons and carrying a combined air group of approximately 137 aircraft, plus the light carrier Ryujo, displacing roughly 12,000 tons, will neutralize Henderson Field from the air and protect the troop convoy simultaneously. Ryujo is assigned the expendable role, drawing American attention while the two larger carriers operate separately and strike when American aircraft are committed elsewhere. It is a sound plan and it nearly works. The American force opposing it centers on two carriers, USS Saratoga, displacing roughly 43,000 tons, and USS Enterprise displacing roughly 25,000 tons, operating under Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher. Combined, their air groups field roughly 176 aircraft, including F-4F Wildcat fighters, SBD Dauntless dive bombers, and TBF Avenger torpedo aircraft. Each SBD carries a single bomb weighing either 500 or 1,000 pounds, depending on mission profile. Each Avenger carries a torpedo weighing 2,000 pounds, or an equivalent bomb load. Fletcher's force also includes the battleship North Carolina, displacing roughly 45,000 tons, whose anti-aircraft battery includes a concentration of 20 mm. and 40 mm guns capable of firing thousands of rounds per minute collectively. On the morning of August 24th, American search aircraft locate Ryujo. Fletcher faces the same decision that carrier commanders face repeatedly in the Pacific War. Commit to the target you have found, or hold back waiting for the larger target you suspect exists somewhere beyond your search radius. The intelligence picture suggests the two larger Japanese carriers are out there. Ryujo looks like exactly the kind of decoy it is. Fletcher sends the strike anyway, committing 38 aircraft from Saratoga toward the light carrier while keeping Enterprise's air group back. Inside the cockpit of an SBD Dauntless flying that strike, the pilot watches altimeter and airspeed while the gunner behind him scans the sky. The aircraft weighs roughly 10,500 pounds fully loaded. Its engine produces 12,200 horsepower. The 1,000 pounds bomb hanging beneath the fuselage changes the aircraft's handling characteristics, enough that experienced pilots feel it in the controls during maneuvers. Ryujo absorbs multiple bomb hits and at least one torpedo strike. The light carrier, whose flight deck armor offers almost no resistance to bombs weighing 0 pounds detonating against it, fractures internally from the hits. Fires spread through the hangar deck. The vessel eventually sinks, taking most of its crew with it. The Japanese decoy plan works in the sense that it draws American aircraft away from the main carriers exactly as intended. While the Saratoga strike is inbound toward Ryujo, Japanese aircraft from Shokaku and Zuikaku, a combined strike of roughly 73 aircraft, including VAL dive bombers and Zero fighters, are already airborne and tracking toward the American carriers. The warning reaches Enterprise with enough time to launch fighters, but not enough time to clear the deck completely. 43 F-4F Wildcats climb to intercept the incoming Japanese strike. The Wildcat weighs roughly 7,500 pounds fully loaded and carries 650 caliber machine guns, firing at a combined rate that can shred an unarmored aircraft within a second of accurate tracking. Its weakness against the more maneuverable Zero, a fighter weighing roughly 600 pounds with superior climb rate and turn radius, means Wildcat pilots are trained to avoid dogfighting and instead use diving attacks that exploit the American aircraft's superior structural strength and diving speed. The interception fractures the Japanese strike formation, but does not stop it. Val dive bombers from Shokaku's air group who push through the fighter screen and begin their attack dives on Enterprise from altitudes above 15,000 feet. Each Val carries a bomb weighing approximately 550 pounds. The dive angle steepens past 60 as the aircraft accelerate toward the carrier below. Enterprise's anti-aircraft battery opens with everything available. The North Carolina nearby adds its own fire, a wall of 20mm and 40mm shells erupting across the sky above the carrier. Gun crews track the diving aircraft manually, leading the target and firing in continuous bursts, while the ship maneuvers at flank speed, attempting to throw off the attacker's aim. 3 bombs strike Enterprise. The first hits the flight deck near the number 3 elevator, penetrating through to decks before detonating. The explosion kills 35 men and fractures structural members across a wide radius of the ship's interior. The second bomb strikes within seconds, detonating near the first hit and compounding the structural damage. The third hits the flight deck at an angle, its explosion less catastrophic, but adding to the fires spreading through the upper decks. Enterprise absorbs all 3 hits and keeps moving. The carrier's damage control parties trained specifically for the scenario of fighting internal fires and flooding, while the ship continues operating respond with a precision that the ship's survival depends on entirely. Pumps engage, fire mains pressurize. Repair crews move through smoke-filled compartments toward the worst damage, while the ship's speed drops slightly as engineers assess the effect on propulsion systems. The flight deck damage temporarily prevents aircraft from landing. Pilots returning from missions orbit overhead, burning fuel measured in gallons per minute, while damage control clears the deck. Some aircraft divert to Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, rather than ditch in the ocean. Others land on Saratoga. The logistical disruption of a damaged flight deck cascades through every subsequent operation the carrier can conduct. What strikes me about Eastern Solomons when studying the engagement in detailed operational terms is how much the battle's outcome hinges on timing gaps measured in minutes. The Japanese strike reaches Enterprise approximately 40 minutes after the American strike departs toward Ryujo. 40 minutes earlier, and a full combat air patrol would have been airborne and positioned. 40 minutes later, and returning American aircraft would have complicated the Japanese attack in different ways. Carrier battles in the Pacific run on intervals this narrow, and the documentation of those intervals in the operational records is precise enough to reconstruct almost minute by minute. The Japanese troop convoy, meanwhile, turns back, with Ryujo sunk, and the American carrier still operational, damaged, but not destroyed. Japanese commanders conclude the air cover necessary to protect 1,500 soldiers approaching Guadalcanal no longer exists in sufficient strength. The convoy reverses course north. The soldiers, who were supposed to reinforce the Japanese garrison on Guadalcanal, do not arrive. Henderson Field stays in American hands for another day. American aircraft losses across the battle reach roughly 20 planes. Japanese losses run higher. Approximately 70 aircraft destroyed between the Ryujo strike, the attack on Enterprise, and the subsequent fighting. Those aircraft losses matter in a calculus that extends well beyond this single engagement, because Japan's ability to replace trained carrier pilots erodes faster than its ability to build new aircraft. A pilot who learns carrier operations over years of training and combat cannot be replaced in months. By late 1942, the attrition of experienced Japanese naval aviators begins grinding into the structural capability of carrier aviation in ways that the Battle of Eastern Solomons accelerates. Enterprise returns to Pearl Harbor for repairs that take roughly 2 months. The damage from 3 bomb hits requires replacing sections of flight deck, repairing structural members across multiple decks, and rebuilding systems that the explosions fractured or destroyed. During those 2 months, Saratoga carries the primary carrier burden in the South Pacific until she too absorbs a torpedo hit from a Japanese submarine in late August and requires her own repair period. 4 stretches of the Guadalcanal campaign. The United States Navy operates in the South Pacific with no fleet carriers available at all. The Battle of Eastern Solomons does not end the carrier contest around Guadalcanal. It is one collision in a sequence that runs through Santa Cruz in October, and the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in November. A sustained campaign of attrition that bleeds both sides' carrier and surface forces across months of fighting in the waters. The American sailors come to call Iron Bottom sound, but Eastern Solomons establishes the pattern. Japanese offensive action to retake Henderson Field drives the fleet engagement. American carriers absorb damage, but hold the line. The Japanese troop convoy fails to reach Guadalcanal. The cycle repeats until one side runs out of the ships, aircraft, and trained men to continue it. If you are somewhere settled now, the kind of quiet that comes when the evening has gone on long enough that the sounds outside have thinned to almost nothing, imagine those 2 carrier forces maneuvering toward each other. Across hundreds of miles of open Pacific, radar operators watching screens, pilots strapping into aircraft on flight decks that could be on fire within the hour, damage control parties standing by with hoses and repair equipment waiting for the hits. They know are coming, the ocean indifferent beneath all of it. This is the entire history of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the carrier clash that followed the Guadalcanal landings during the Second World War. Chapter 1. The Unfinished Map. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons, fought on the 24th and the 25th of August, 1942, was not a planned confrontation. Neither side woke up in the spring of that year and drew a map with arrows pointing toward each other in the waters north of Guadalcanal. It grew organically, almost accidentally, out of a single Allied decision to land Marines on an island that most senior American commanders had barely heard of 3 months before they sent men to die there. The island was Guadalcanal. It sat at the southern end of the Solomon Islands chain, roughly 600 nautical miles southeast of the major Japanese base at Raba. It was hot, malarial, covered in jungle, and as of the 7th of August, 1942, the site of an unfinished Japanese airstrip that the Allied High Command had decided it absolutely could not allow Japan to complete. The Allied landings on the 7th of August, 1942 were executed primarily by the 1st Marine Division, and they caught the Japanese genuinely off guard. The construction crew on Guadalcanal's northern coastal plain, workers from a Korean labor battalion, not combat troops, scattered into the surrounding jungle when the first shells fell. They were, in a very specific operational sense, irrelevant to what happened next. What mattered was what they'd left behind: a partially graded airstrip, some abandoned engineering machinery, a stockpile of captured Japanese materials, including a road roller weighing an estimated 4.22 tons and enough diesel fuel to run equipment 4 weeks. The Marines didn't just seize the airstrip, they seized the means to finish it. Working parties extended the runway from approximately 2,600 feet to short for combat aircraft by the standard 3,000 feet minimum to 3,778 feet in roughly 48 hours using that captured Japanese road roller alongside their own equipment. That road roller is not a footnote. It's the reason an operational airfield existed in the Solomon Islands on the morning of August 8, 1942. I want to be honest about something here. When you look at the pre-war and early war Allied planning documents, Guadalcanal is conspicuously absent. The July 1942 strategic conferences that authorized the Pacific Offensive identified Tulagi, the harbor across from Guadalcanal, as the primary objective. The area strip on Guadalcanal was almost an afterthought. identified by aerial reconnaissance in late July. The entire campaign that would consume 6 months, hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of lives, and fundamentally alter the Pacific War's trajectory grew from a reconnaissance photograph taken less than 3 weeks before the landings. No one planned for Guadalcanal. They improvised it and then they couldn't leave. The Japanese reaction moved through several distinct phases. The signals log entry, enemy intentions unknown, captures the first phase, confusion. The second phase came quickly, land-based air response from the 11th Air Fleet at Rabaul, which dispatched 54 bombers and fighters on the 8th of August to attack the invasion fleet. What those Japanese crews faced was staggering in its difficulty. Rabaul to Guadalcanal was roughly 560 nautical miles, approximately the same as flying from London to reach a target somewhere over the Mediterranean, with no land beneath you the entire way. The Mitsubishi G4 square meters medium bomber, the Allied code name was Betty, which sounds almost gentle given what these aircraft could do, had a combat radius that made this mission technically possible and operationally brutal. Crews arrived over target with near empty tanks, almost no time over target, an exhausted judgment. The structural problem of Rabaul's distance from Guadalcanal would never be solved. It was baked into the geography. Then came the night of the 8th into the 9th of August. Vice Admiral Gonichi Mikowa took a force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer down from the Shortland Islands, entered the waters between Guadalcanal and Savo Island in darkness, and destroyed an Allied screening squadron with a speed and efficiency that remains one of the most devastating tactical performances by a surface force in the Pacific War. 4 heavy cruisers, 3 American, 1 Australian, were sunk in approximately 32 minutes. The USS Quincy, the USS Vincennes, the USS Arturia, and Muscanba. Nearly 1,000 Allied sailors killed in a single night action. And then Mawa turned around and went home without attacking the vulnerable, fully loaded Allied transport fleet sitting in the anchorage. The transport survived. The Marines kept their supplies. And the Japanese Naval Command never quite understood what they'd left alive that night. Savo Island cast a very long shadow over everything that followed. For the Allied forces in the South Pacific, it was a brutally clear demonstration that the Japanese surface navy was capable, aggressive, and willing to operate in waters they claimed as their own. For the Japanese, Savo was a tactical triumph that paradoxically reinforced a kind of strategic overconfidence, the belief that when the moment came to destroy the Allied carrier force, the surface fleet would finish the job. That belief would be tested on the 24th of August. Between the 15th and the 20th of August, something else happened that would prove just as consequential as that Savo Island defeat. Admiral Fletcher's 3 carrier task forces built around USS Saratoga, USS Enterprise, and USS Wasp covered a ferry mission that delivered the first 31 combat aircraft to the newly operational Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, carried aboard the escort carrier USS Long Island, 19 F-4F Wildcat fighters and 12 SPD Dauntless dive bombers. These aircraft were the seed of what Allied forces would call the Cactus Air Force. The name came from cactus, the Allied code word for Guadalcanal, and the moment those aircraft landed at Henderson Field, the entire strategic geometry of the southern Solomon Islands changed. Control of that airfield now meant something very specific. Any Japanese surface force transiting within roughly 200 meters of Guadalcanal during daylight hours was potentially within range of land-based aircraft. This wasn't theoretical, it was mathematical, and it meant that the Japanese plan to retake Guadalcanal, so named Operation Call from the first syllable of the Japanese name for the island, had to incorporate either the rapid recapture or the systematic destruction of that airfield. The Japanese naval forces, commanded ultimately by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, assembled their counter-offensive force. It was considerable. 2 fleet carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, with their full air groups, a light carrier, Ryujo, a vanguard force of battleships and cruisers, an advanced force under Vice Admiral Naoki Kondo, and a reinforcement convoy of 3 slow transport ships, carrying 1,411 soldiers from the 28th Ichiki Infantry Regiment, escorted by Rear Admiral Ryujo Tanaka, in the light cruiser Jinsu. All of this was aimed at Guadalcanal, all of it converging on the last week of August, 1942. What strikes me most looking at this opening phase is how much the battle was shaped. Before a single aircraft launched or a single radar antenna rotated, the aerial strip the Marines extended in 48 hours using captured machinery. The Tsavo Island defeat that left the Japanese overconfident and the Allies wary. The by Catalina patrol planes based at Indeni in the Santa Cruz Islands, flying search patterns over hundreds of miles of open ocean, looking for exactly the kind of force Tanaka was sailing. These weren't dramatic moments. They were administrative and logistical facts that accumulated until they produced a collision. History works like this more often than we'd prefer. Not through decisive heroic choices, but through the weight of accumulated circumstances pressing two forces together at a point neither fully chose. The unfinished Japanese signals log entry, the pinstroke that trails off, is the honest symbol for how this battle began. Nobody finished the sentence. The war finished it for them. On the 21st of August, the main Japanese naval force departed True Lagoon, heading southeast toward the Solomon Islands. On the same day, Fletcher's carrier task forces reversed course toward Guadalcanal from their holding position, roughly 400 nautical miles to the south. Both fleets were now moving toward the same patch of ocean. A United States Navy by Catalina operating out of Indeni made the first sighting of Tanaka's convoy at 09:05 on the 23rd of August. By that evening, with no further sightings of Japanese carriers and Tanaka having turned north to evade an expected air attack, Fletcher made a decision that would become one of the most scrutinized command choices of the Pacific War. He detached USS Wasp, one of his 3 carriers, for refueling, and with that, to carrier task forces instead of 3 would face whatever was coming. The unfinished map had been folded, and someone had just removed a third of the pieces from the board. Chapter 2, Shokaku, Zuikaku, and the Weight of Coral Sea. Here is something that gets lost in most accounts of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Both Japanese fleet carriers present at the battle, Shokaku and Zuikaku, were by every objective measurement of design and material capability 2 of the finest warships afloat in 1942. They displaced roughly 32,000 tons at full load. Their flight decks were more than 800 feet in length. They carried between 60 and 72 aircraft. Their fuel capacity gave them an operational range of roughly 9,500 nautical miles at economical cruise speed, meaning they could in theory operate across the entire Pacific without refueling. They were faster than any American fleet carrier of the period, capable of sustained 34-knot speeds. Everything about them on paper should have been a source of institutional confidence. It wasn't. And understanding why it wasn't is more important than any description of their structural specifications. The Coral Sea, the 7th and the 8th of May 1942. That's where the explanation begins. The battle itself, fought in the waters south of the Louisiana archipelago, was the first carrier engagement in history in which the opposing surface forces never came within visual range of each other. All attacks were conducted by carrier-based aircraft, and by any reasonable tactical accounting, Japan won. The American carrier Lexington was sunk. Yorktown was heavily damaged. A Japanese invasion convoy targeting Port Moresby was turned back, but Shokaku took 3 bomb hits from American dive bombers that required 3 months of dockyard repair at Naval Arsenal in Japan, and Zuikaku's air group flying against American carriers in their first extended carrier combat operations lost approximately 46 aircraft, and a substantial portion of the experienced air crew who flew them. I've spent a good deal of time with the strength returns and training records from this period, and what fascinates me genuinely, because the numbers are so stark, is the gap between what was listed on paper and what was operationally real. A strength return from Zuikaku's air group, dated the 18th of August 1942, just 3 days before the carrier force sailed from Truk toward Guadalcanal, lists 84 aircraft available, but a handwritten annotation attributed in post-war analysis to Air Group U Commander, Lieutenant Commander Shikazu Shimazaki, reads in Japanese Jiken Nashi, roughly translated no real experience. 11 characters written in a margin engine. They weren't describing the aircraft. They were describing the men who would fly them. The pre-war standard for a combat-qualified Japanese carrier dive bomber pilot required 700 flight hours before carrier qualification. The replacement aviators who arrived to rebuild Zuikaku's air group after the Coral Sea losses averaged, by reconstructed training records, roughly 273 flight hours. The gap, 427 hours per pilot across more than 100 replacement aircrew, was not a personnel problem. It was a structural wound that the Japanese Navy had given itself. Shokaku's repair period at Kyoei Naval Arsenal produced its own set of complications that tend to be overlooked. The dockyard workers who rebuilt the damaged sections of her flight deck and interior structures used materials that were in at least one documented respect subtly different from the original construction specifications. The Japanese Naval Technical Mission records captured post-war note that a rebuilt section of the aft flight deck incorporated a steel composition with marginally lower resistance to armor-piercing ordnance than the original material. This wasn't incompetence. The shipyard used what it had available under wartime production pressures, but the variance was noted by structural engineers in their repair documentation, and was by all available evidence not communicated upward in the operational chain of command. The ship's captain may never have known. The ship went to sea at Eastern Solomons with a flight deck that was in one specific section, not quite what it appeared to be. The composition of the Japanese carrier force that sorted from True on the 21st of August, 1942, was divided into 3 operational groups. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nogumo commanded from Shokaku, and led the main body, which included Shokaku, Zuikaku, Ryujo, and a screening force of 1 heavy cruiser and 8 destroyers. Rear Admiral Hiroki Abe commanded the vanguard force. To battleships, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 6 destroyers. Vice Admiral Naoki Kondo commanded the advanced force of 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 5 destroyers, the seaplane carrier Cheetos, and a covering group centered on the battleship Mutsu. Land-based support. Roughly 100 bombers, fighters, and reconnaissance aircraft at Rabaul and nearby islands. This was not a small operation. This was a committed major fleet action involving some of the most powerful warships Japan possessed, directed toward a single objective: finding and destroying the American carrier force in the South Pacific, and then delivering the army troops who would retake Guadalcanal. Nogumo's positioning decision, placing his main carrier force behind the vanguard and advanced forces as they steamed south, was a deliberate attempt to remain hidden from American reconnaissance aircraft until the American carriers had been located and a decisive strike could be launched. The call plan, as historians have reconstructed it, envisioned a specific sequence. Nogumo's scouts or one of the Japanese surface forces would draw out or locate the American carriers. Nogumo would immediately launch an all-out strike. The American carrier force, destroyed or crippled, would leave the water clear for Abe's vanguard and Kondo's advanced force to close in and destroy whatever remained in a surface action. Then Tanaka's convoy would land its troops. Then Henderson Field would be bombarded into submission by Japanese naval guns. Then Guadalcanal would be retaken. It was a plan with a certain logical elegance, and it rested on every step working in sequence. The problem with elegant sequential plans is that they are enormously sensitive to the failure of any single link. At the Coral Sea, the Japanese had discovered that American carrier pilots could find your ships even when you didn't think you'd been spotted. At Midway, just 10 weeks before Eastern Solomons, they discovered something far worse. That 4 fleet carriers could be destroyed in approximately 6 minutes of concentrated dive bombing from aircraft whose own carrier had been found by a scout plane. whose radio report had been received in time. Nagumo had been at Midway. He'd watched Akogi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiru burn. He knew in a very visceral institutional sense what carrier vulnerability looked like, from the receiving end. Whether that knowledge made him more cautious at Eastern Solomons, or whether it shaped the specific decision he made at 0145 on the 24th of August, is something I think about quite a bit when I look at the sequence of events that followed. There is also the question, and this is a genuinely contested historiographical point, of what the Ryujo detachment was actually supposed to accomplish. The light carrier Ryujo with Rear Admiral Chuichiha's task unit was ordered ahead of the main force in the early morning hours of the 24th of August to conduct an attack on Henderson Field with aircraft, while the main carriers held back in readiness. The official Japanese operational documents frame this as a tactical feint. Detach Ryujo to draw American attention, allowing Shokaku and Zuikaku to approach undetected. But Rear Admiral Tamichihara, commanding the destroyer Amatsukas, which was part of Ryujo's screening force, wrote in his post-war memoir that his understanding of the mission was fundamentally different. Hera believed Ryujo was there to support Tanaka's convoy by neutralizing Henderson Field's aircraft, not to serve as bait. These are different missions. A feint means Ryujo was expected to be found and attacked. A convoy support mission means the commander expected to strike and withdraw. Hodder described the distinction in terms that suggest the men sailing on Ryujo were not, as far as they knew, sailing as decoys toward their own destruction. The replacement pilot problem wasn't abstract. It had a specific mechanism. The Japanese Naval Bureau of Aeronautics pre-war training pipeline was built on a philosophy of extraordinary selectivity at the entry point. Only the best candidates were accepted, put through a training regimen of exceptional rigor, and produced at the relatively modest annual rate of roughly 100 to 150 carrier-qualified aviators per year across the entire fleet. This was in the context of the 1930s entirely rational. Japan was not fighting a long attritional war. It was preparing for a short decisive conflict in which the superiority of its aviators, one deeply experienced Japanese pilot versus whatever the Americans could produce, would be sufficient. Then Midway happened. Then the Coral Sea losses hadn't yet been replaced. Then the first days of the Guadalcanal campaign produced more attrition. And then the main fleet sailed for Eastern Solomons with their group-ups that were by the annotation in Zuikaku's own records not yet ready for what was coming. When the fleet sorted from Truk on the 21st of August, steaming southeast toward the Solomon Islands, there was no way for Nagumo or his staff to know exactly what they'd find. American signal intelligence had detected the carrier's departure, but had not fully resolved the composition of the force bearing down on Guadalcanal. On both sides, the picture was incomplete. Both sides sent aircraft scouting. Both sides shot down the other scouts at critical moments. On the 22nd of August, at least one Japanese reconnaissance aircraft was intercepted and destroyed by Enterprise fighters before it could transmit its sighting report, which led the Japanese to strongly suspect that American carriers were nearby, though they couldn't confirm where. The game of radar traces, scout aircraft, and radio intercepts was already underway 2 full days before the main engagement. The ships that would fight on the 24th of August were already, in a very real sense, fighting, not with guns or bombs, but with information, uncertainty, and the slowly narrowing geography of the open ocean. Chapter 3. The admiral who sent away 1/3 of his fleet, at 1823, on the 23rd of August, 1942, USS Wasp and the rest of Task Force 18 turned south and began the 2-day transit at Eat Island for refueling. The entry in Saratoga's decalogue is clean and unremarkable. Task Force 18 detached per Commander Task Force 61 order departed area preceding Eat. 6 words 56 aircraft, a full air group of Wildcats, and Dauntlesses and Avengers plus 2,247 crew members sailing away from the waters, where the following morning the biggest carrier battle since Midway would be fought without them. There are moments in military history where a single administrative act, a detachment order, a refueling schedule, a departure logged in a deck entry, carries more consequence than any tactical decision made under fire. This is one of them. Vice Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher has not been well served by popular history. He commanded the American carrier force at the Coral Sea, at Midway, and at Eastern Solomons, three of the most consequential naval engagements of the Pacific War, and won tactical advantages in all three. Yet, his reputation has been consistently clouded by a narrative of excessive caution that was shaped, in substantial part, by the post-war writing of Samuel Eliot Morison. Morison's 7-volume History of American Naval Operations in World War I is genuinely monumental, but it was written with access to testimony from officers who had institutional reasons to be hasty. Later Fletcher and Morison had a tendency to treat boldness as a cardinal naval virtue, and its absence as a character flaw. The result was a portrait of Fletcher as a man who pulled back when he should have pressed forward, and that portrait became the dominant one for decades. It wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't the whole story either. The whole story starts with the fuel arithmetic, and the fuel arithmetic, when you actually look at the operational records, rather than the post-war memoirs, is considerably less ambiguous than the criticisms imply. USS Wasp at the time of her detachment was carrying approximately 188.0 gallons of aviation gasoline, enough for roughly 3.5 combat flight cycles for her full air group, under the operational tempo they'd been maintaining, at the fuel burn rates observed during the preceding weeks of carrier operations. She had approximately 31 to 36 hours of sustained flight operations available before she'd need replenishment. The nearest tanker was at Otter, today's transit south. Fletcher had requested and received prior authorization from Admiral Chester Nimitz at Senpak to detach Wasp for exactly this purpose. This authorization is in the CNCPC records. It is not ambiguous. Fletcher was not acting unilaterally or rashly. He was executing a refueling cycle that his theater commander had approved. Nearly every critical account of this decision in the subsequent decades omits the CNCPC authorization entirely. I find that omission telling, not because it proves Fletcher was right. Command decisions can be simultaneously authorized and wrong, but because its consistent omission suggests that the critics weren't actually engaging with the documentary record. They were constructing a narrative about a man's character and selecting facts that fit it. That's not historical analysis. That's a verdict in search of evidence. What the actual record shows is a flag officer making a fuel state decision, consistent with established doctrine, with prior approval from his superior in a situation where he genuinely did not know that a major Japanese carrier force was less than 24 hours from combat range. He didn't know because his intelligence was incomplete. No American commander in the South Pacific in August 1942 had a complete picture of the Japanese order of battle bearing down on them. There is another intelligence failure embedded in this moment that gets almost no attention. American signal intelligence in August 1942 had detected Shokaku and Zuikaku, but had not definitively identified Ryujo as a third carrier attached to Nagumo's main force. Fletcher's tactical planning was built on an assumption of two Japanese fleet carriers, a manageable asymmetry given the Coral Sea and Midway precedents. He didn't know he was facing three. That difference matters. If you're holding aircraft in reserve against a potential Shokaku-Zuikaku strike, and you don't know Ryujo exists as a separate forward element, you're making entirely rational decisions with incomplete information, which is the only kind of information any commander in combat ever has. The intelligence gap wasn't Fletcher's failure. It was the collective failure of the entire Allied intelligence architecture in the South Pacific, which was still being built essentially from scratch. So, here is what Fletcher had on the morning of the 24th of August, 1942, to carrier task forces, Task Force 11 around Saratoga, his flagship, and Task Force 16 around Enterprise, combined, roughly 176 aircraft, 1 battleship, USS North Carolina, newly arrived and still working up in the South Pacific, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 11 destroyers. Against him, approximately 171 to 177 Japanese carrier aircraft across 3 carriers, though he didn't know about all 3, plus Abe's Vanguard, plus Kondo's advanced force, plus Tanaka's convoy, plus roughly 100 land-based aircraft at Rebel. Fletcher's carrier force was by any objective count of aircraft and surface warships outnumbered. He was also operating without Wasp and her pilots. He was also 3 months removed from Midway and 5 months removed from the Coral Sea, which means every senior officer in both task forces understood viscerally and personally what happened to carriers that were caught in the wrong position. What Fletcher did with those 2 remaining carriers was to position them roughly 200 meters southeast of Guadalcanal, close enough to respond to any Japanese thrust toward the island, far enough south to reduce the risk of a nighttime surface engagement with Abe's fast battleships, and positioned to take advantage of his advanced scouting assets. In the early morning hours of the 24th, between 0555 and 0630, Enterprise launched the bulk of the search aircraft, scout planes operating in expanding arcs to the north and northwest, looking for the Japanese fleet that everyone knew was out there somewhere. By Catalinas from the patrol wing at Indeni covered additional sectors. It was methodical, professional, and ultimately incomplete because the geometry of ocean search is always a contest between the area you can cover and the area your enemy is using. At 0935, a Catalina made the first sighting of Ryujo's force, the carrier, the heavy cruiser Ton, and to destroyers steaming southwest, not the main Japanese carrier force, the forward element. Fletcher's next decision to wait before launching a strike, to continue searching for the main Japanese carriers before committing Saratoga's aircraft, has been criticized extensively, and in retrospect, knowing what we now know about where Shokaku and Zuikaku were and when they were found, the criticism has at least a surface plausibility, but what the critics don't fully account for is that Fletcher was specifically and explicitly trying to avoid the Midway error in reverse. At Midway, the Americans had committed every available aircraft to a strike on the Japanese carriers, and when the Japanese launched their own strike in return, there was almost nothing left for fleet defense. Fletcher didn't want to empty his flight decks chasing Ryujo, and then find himself with nothing overhead when Shokaku and Zuikaku found him. At 1340 on the 24th of August, with still no firm word on the main Japanese carrier position, he finally launched 38 aircraft from Saratoga against Ryujo. He held aircraft in reserve. Both decisions, launching and holding, were defensible. Both decisions had costs. What I find genuinely remarkable about this particular set of command choices isn't the decisions themselves, it's the time pressure embedded in all of them. Fletcher was making calls about reserving versus committing aircraft, about Wasp's fuel state, about whether Ryujo was a decoy or a standalone target, while simultaneously managing a carrier task force, monitoring his own radar picture, coordinating with Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, and tracking a Japanese reinforcement convoy that was supposed to arrive the following day. The tempo of information flowing into a flag officer situation report in carrier combat wasn't a trickle, it was a flood, with significant portions of the flood being contradictory, delayed, or simply wrong. His flag secretary's logs from this period preserved in the naval records show decision entries, sometimes only minutes apart. The operational pause to wait for better intelligence, that critics describe as hesitation, looks from the timing data considerably more like a managing a full situation board rather than standing frozen at the rail. The carrier battle that emerged from these decisions, from the fuel arithmetic, from the partial intelligence picture, from the decision to launch against Ryujo while holding for the main force, was imperfect in its coordination, disorderly in its execution, and ultimately effective in its outcome. It was also exactly the kind of battle that happens when experienced commanders make reasonable decisions with the information they actually have, rather than the information historians later wish they'd possessed. The Wasp was fueling at a fate when the dive bombers fell on Enterprise. She wasn't there to help. She also wasn't there to be torpedoed. Both things are true and neither cancels the other. Chapter 4. Ryujo, the expendable carrier. She was launched in 1930 at Yokohama, originally designed under the constraints of the Washington Naval Treaty, as a carrier displacing 10,000 tons, the maximum permitted for vessels not counted against the treaty's overall carrier tonnage limits. But the design kept growing. A second hangar deck was added that the original structural plans had never accounted for. The final displacement came in at roughly 10,600 tons, her hull riding lower in the water than her designers had calculated, her center of gravity elevated by the additional hangar weight in ways that made her noticeably unstable in heavy seas. Her own officers described her as difficult in bad weather. She rolled unpredictably. Her flight operations were limited by sea state conditions that larger carriers could ignore. In a fleet that possessed Shokaku and Zuikaku, 32,000-ton instruments of naval precision, Ryujo was the awkward compromise, the vessel that existed because treaty accountants needed a number to work with, and naval planners needed a ship to fill it. None of this made her unimportant. Between 1941 and 1942, Ryujo had operated in the Philippines campaign, in the Dutch East Indies, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Aleutians during the Midway operation. She had covered landings, supported ground forces, launched strikes against shore installations. She had survived, and the crew that sailed her, approximately 920 men under Rear Admiral Shuichi Hoda's Task Unit Command, were experienced in the specific rhythms of carrier operations in the Pacific. They weren't a training unit. They weren't a sacrifice. They were professional naval aviators and sailors who had been at war for 9 months. What happened at 0145 on the 24th of August is the moment I keep returning to. Whenever this battle is discussed in purely tactical terms, Nogumo aboard Shokaku somewhere to the north sent the signal. Rear Admiral Hoda was to proceed ahead of the main force, strike Henderson Field at daybreak, and provide air cover and support for Tanaka's approaching convoy. The signal was sent by lamp rather than radio. The fleet was maintaining strict radio silence to avoid detection. And because it went by lamp, because it was a one-directional signal from a senior to a subordinate in total darkness, on an open ocean, Hoda had no practical means to query it, dispute it, or suggest alternatives. He acknowledged and executed. In Tamichi's memoir, he commanded the destroyer Amitsukas, one of the 2 destroyers screening Ryujo. He writes that the mission, as he understood it from his orders, was convoy support. Neutralize Henderson Field to prevent its aircraft from attacking Tanaka's transports. Not a feint, not bait. A genuine tactical support mission for the reinforcement operation. Whether Ryujo's detachment was a deliberate feint or genuine operational support is a question historians have argued about without fully resolving, and I don't think it can be resolved with the sources currently available. What can be said with confidence is this: the outcome was the same regardless of intent. A light carrier with a total of 37 embarked aircraft, 16 Zeros and 21 level bombers operating 200 meters ahead of the main fleet, without benefit of the main fleet surface screening force, or anti-aircraft umbrella, was objectively exposed. Whether Nogumo expected her to be found and attacked, or genuinely expected her to strike and withdraw before the Americans could respond, the operational reality was that Ryujo was alone in waters, that American reconnaissance aircraft were actively searching. At 12:20 on the 24th, Ryujo launched her strike. 6 Nakajima B-5 enter-level bombers and 15 A-6 M30 fighters bound for Henderson Field. They flew southwest, climbing over the tropical haze. What they didn't know, couldn't know because the radio silence and weather that had returned the rebel bombers to their base hadn't been communicated down to Ryujo's flight crews, was that the 24 Mitsubishi G4 square meters bombers from Rebel, who were supposed to attack Henderson Field simultaneously, had already turned back at 11:30 due to severe weather over their route. Ryujo's 6-level bombers were going in alone against a fully alerted airfield with fighter cover from the Cactus Air Force. The strike arrived over Henderson Field at 14:23, tangled with the Marine and Army fighters based there, and lost 3 bombers and 3 Zeros. No significant damage was done to the field. The cost ratio was brutal. A third of the bomber force destroyed, a fifth of the fighter escort destroyed. Henderson Field untouched. Saratoga's radar picked up Ryujo's returning aircraft while they were still outbound toward Guadalcanal, triangulating backward to the carrier's approximate launch position at 1340, with Ryujo's position now known, and the main Japanese carrier force still unlocated. Fletcher authorized the Saratoga strike. 38 aircraft, a mix of 30 SPD Dauntless dive bombers from Scouting 3 and Bombing 3, and 8 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Command of the strike fell to Commander Harry Dornfeld. The aircraft flew north in tight formation, climbing above the broken cloud layer that covered much of the central Solomons region. That afternoon, the Avengers are worth pausing on. The TBF Avenger had entered combat operations just weeks before Eastern Solomons, and the Mark 13 aerial torpedo it carried was documenting a worrying behavioral profile. Erratic running, porpoising on water entry, occasional failure to detonate. The release parameters were demanding: no higher than 150 feet above the water surface, no faster than 110 knots airspeed. This meant the Avenger pilot had to fly a low, slow, straight attack run directly toward a defended target through the anti-aircraft fire of the carrier, the heavy cruiser tone, and both screening destroyers before releasing his weapon. One crew member in a debriefing from this period described those release parameters as operationally suicidal against a defended target. The fact that they did it anyway, that at least one torpedo, by the most plausible reconstruction of the damage evidence, struck Ryujo, says something about the quality of those crews, that the standard battle narrative tends to compress into a single sentence. The attack on Ryujo began around 1,400 hours. American strike reports recorded 3 to 5 bomb hits and a probable torpedo. Japanese survivor accounts reconstructed post-war from testimony by men rescued by Amatsukas and Tokitsukas confirmed 3 definite bomb hits and described the torpedo question inconsistently. Some survivors felt what they described as a torpedo explosion. Others recalled only bomb detonations. Given that Ryujo sank slowly, still afloat at sunset before capsizing sometime after dark, a torpedo hit that flooded a non-critical compartment without producing an immediately catastrophic result is operationally plausible. The ship's structural weakness, her elevated center of gravity, her tendency to ride low, would have made progressive flooding from bomb damage alone sufficient to destabilize her. The end result was identical regardless of which weapon caused the fatal flooding. By mid-afternoon on the 24th of August, 1942, Ryujo was a burning listing wreck. At some point in the failing light of that afternoon, the order to abandon ship was given. The last entry in Ryujo's deck log recovered floating in the wreckage by Amatsuka's crew, and cited in the post-war reconstruction notes flooding severe. A port list of approximately 15 and the order to abandon ship. Amatsukas and Tokitsukas moved in through the wreckage field. Tamayuchara describes the rescue in terms that are spare and precise. Men covered in furnace oil, the water dark and difficult to work in. The sounds of a crew trying to survive. 120 men from Ryujo's complement of roughly 920 did not survive. APPROXAMATELY 320 were pulled from the water. Among those rescued were several Zero pilots from the Henderson Field strike who, having returned from their mission and found their carrier dying, had ditched their aircraft in the water nearby and were found floating on the surface. They'd survived the strike, survived the return, and then watched their ship go down. Some of those pilots would fly again. Some of them would be at Santa Cruz 2 months later. Ryujo capsized and sank after dark. Amatsukas, Tokitsukas, and the heavy cruiser Tone rejoined Nagumo's main force. The waters north of the Santa Cruz Islands closed over the carrier without ceremony. She had done what she'd been sent to do, or what she'd been used as. That question, what she was actually sent to do, died with her orders. Chapter 5. The Radar Room. There is a piece of equipment aboard USS Enterprise in August of 1942 that almost nobody talks about when they discuss the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, and it's the piece of equipment that probably determined the battle's outcome, more than any tactical decision made by any admiral on either side. It weighed 4,440 pounds. Its antenna array was roughly 17 feet wide, a rectangular structure of aluminum tubing and wire mesh that rotated at approximately 5 revolutions per minute at the top of the ship's forward mast. It operated on a wavelength of 112 meters. It could detect a large formation of aircraft at a range of roughly 100 meters. It was called the CXME-1 radar, and the men who operated it called it, with the particular affection sailors reserve for unreliable equipment they depend on completely, the bed spring, because that's what the antenna looked like. The CXM-1 was not, by any modern standard of electronic warfare, a sophisticated instrument. It produced a two-dimensional plot, bearing, and range. That was it. No altitude data. No count of individual aircraft within a formation. A group of 30 dive bombers appeared on the scope as a single merged return, indistinguishable from a group of 10 fighters at the same range and bearing. Its operators had to interpret the strength and character of the return, how bright, how wide, how it moved to estimate whether they were looking at a small patrol or a full attack formation. They got reasonably good at this. Good enough to give critical tactical warning. Not good enough to provide the precise three-dimensional situational picture that effective fighter direction requires. The gap between what the radar could show and what the fighter director officer needed to know was on the 24th of August, 1940 to measured in burning aircraft and dead men. Lieutenant Junior Grade John Baumeister was Enterprise's fighter director officer. His job, in the simplest terms, sit in Combat Information Center, watch the radar scope, talk to airborne fighters on the radio, and position them to intercept incoming threats before those threats reach the ship. In practice, this meant managing a radio circuit that all 53 scrambled Wildcat fighters shared simultaneously. One frequency, one channel, dozens of pilots, while reading a two-dimensional radar plot that couldn't tell him how high the incoming aircraft were, while trying to communicate intercept vectors with enough precision to put his fighters above and ahead of Japanese dive bombers approaching at roughly 150 knots. The radio circuit problem alone was nearly paralyzing. Pilots stepping on each other's transmissions. Those instructions blocked by simultaneous voices. The technology that was supposed to make radar-directed fighter defense work was in August of 1942, operating at the absolute outer edge of its functional capacity. At 162 on the 24th, Enterprise's radar scope lit up with a contact bearing north roughly 88 miles out. Altitude unknown. Character of return consistent with a large formation. The log entry reads bearing heading many 88 meters, approximately 12,000 feet altitude. The altitude estimates derived from a combination of radar return strength and a report from one of the scout aircraft already airborne. The operators passed the contact to the fighter director. Baumeister began directing his Wildcats, 53 F-4 fighters in the air climbing at approximately 1,500 feet per minute from their various positions around the task force to reach 15,000 feet, the minimum useful altitude for a diving intercept of incoming dive bombers takes roughly 10 minutes of sustained climbing. The contact is 88 miles out at approximately 150 knots. Roughly 35 minutes of flight time to reach the task force. The math on paper worked. The IFFF system didn't. If identification friend or foe was the transponder system that allowed the radar to distinguish between American and Japanese aircraft returns on the scope. In August of 1942, the IF transponders aboard the carrier aircraft were not synchronized with Enterprise's radar operators in a way that functioned reliably under combat conditions. The practical result: Baumeister's scope showed a mix of American fighters climbing to intercept and Japanese dive bombers inbound, and the scope could not reliably distinguish between them. He hesitated on several intercept vectors, specifically moments where he wasn't certain whether a closing return was an American Wildcat still climbing to altitude or a Japanese aircraft beginning its attack run. Those hesitations cost minutes. Minutes in carrier air defense translate directly into altitude. Fighters that don't reach 15,000 feet before the dive bombers push over from their attack altitude don't get clean intercept geometry. They chase instead of intercept. They fire from disadvantageous angles. They don't stop the attack. Enterprise's after-action report states that 53 Wildcats were directed toward the incoming Japanese formation. John Lunson's exhaustive reconstruction of the fighter combat in the first team, the most detailed tactical analysis of Guadalcanal-era carrier aviation available, suggests that communication failures, if confusion, and the altitude limitation of the CX-1 meant that fewer than 15 Wildcats made effective interceptions before the dive bombers began their attack runs. That gap, 53 scrambled, perhaps 15 effective, is not an indictment of the fighter director or the pilots. It's an indictment of a system being pushed beyond its design limits in its first major combat test. The 53 versus 15 contrast is worth sitting with, because it defines both the promise and the reality of radar-directed carrier defense in this period of the war. The promise was almost total interception. The reality was partial, chaotic, and ultimately insufficient to prevent the attack from getting through. There's something else the radar record shows that I find genuinely striking. When you work through the timing, Enterprise's damage control logs cross-referenced against the radar operations log document. 7-minute period of intermittent radar operations following the bomb hits at 16:29 through 16:46. The ship's electrical system was partially disrupted by the bomb damage, and radar power was fluctuating. During those 7 minutes, the second wave of Japanese aircraft, 9 Zeros and 27 additional D-3A dive bombers launched from Shokaku and Zuikaku at 1600, and they were approaching from the north, was theoretically inbound. They didn't attack. They couldn't find the carrier formation because Enterprise and Saratoga had moved roughly 38 meters south during the 2 hours since the first attack. But if they had found the position, if their navigation had placed them over the task force during those 7 minutes of degraded radar coverage, the battle might have ended differently. The second wave eventually turned back without attacking, and lost 5 aircraft to operational mishaps on the return flight to their carriers. Enterprise's luck in those 7 minutes was also geography. The CX-1 radar that gave Enterprise her 24-minute warning on the 24th of August was in its fundamental engineering-built Aono-Yogi-Yuda antenna design, a phased array configuration developed by the Japanese physicist Hidetsugu Yogi in 1926. It's one of those facts that sits quietly in the technical record until you notice it. The aircraft diving on Enterprise were in a specific and traceable sense being tracked by technology derived from the work of a Japanese scientist. Whether that's ironic or merely coincidental depends on how you read the relationship between scientific knowledge, which crosses borders freely, and military application, which emphatically does not. The physics didn't care which flag was flying. The radar room on the 24th of August, 1942 was a crowded, hot, loud compartment full of operators doing their absolute best with equipment that was, even by the standards of its time, at the edge of what was technically possible. The men working that scope in those radio circuits, the FDO, the scope operators, the radio talkers passing contacts and vectors, were performing a task that had no established doctrine, no operational precedent of any depth, and no margin for error. They didn't have a manual that told them how to direct 53 fighters in a single-channel radio environment while reading altitude blind contacts on a bedspring antenna. They figured it out as they went. They didn't stop the attack, but they gave Enterprise 24 minutes of warning. That warning was the difference between a task force that had no time to maneuver, no fighters in the air, and no anti-aircraft crews at their stations, and the tactical situation that actually existed when the dive bombers pushed over. 24 minutes. That's what the radar room produced. It's not nothing. It's arguably everything. Chapter 6. 19 seconds over the Big E. At 16:29 on the 24th of August, 1942, the first of Lieutenant Commander Momori's 27 HD-3A dive bombers rolled over into its attack dive on USS Enterprise. The carrier was doing roughly 30 knots, her helm hard over in a tight turning maneuver. Captain Arthur Davis had been altering course every 15 to 20 seconds since the Japanese formation appeared on the radar scope, deliberately making the ship's track as unpredictable as possible, using the ship's full speed and turning ability to complicate the attack geometry for pilots who needed a stable target presentation to deliver their bombs accurately. The first 9 D3 as attacked and missed. Every bomb went to starboard. In short, the anti-aircraft fire from Enterprise, the battleship USS North Carolina, the heavy cruiser USS Portland, the light cruiser USS Atlanta, and the 6 escorting destroyers was intense enough that the incoming pilots were pulling their attacks early and dropping from less than optimal release points. The turns worked, the fire worked. 9 bombs, 9 misses. The 2nd Division of Dive Bombers was led by Lieutenant Kageyama, and they pressed their attacks more precisely. The first bomb to hit Enterprise dropped by Petty Officer Kyoto Furuta at approximately 16:38 was a 250 kilograms semi-hour piercing delayed action bomb. This distinction matters enormously and has been almost entirely ignored in popular accounts of the battle. A semi-hour piercing bomb with a delayed fuse is designed to penetrate before detonating. It hit the flight deck near the aft elevator, punched through the yellow pine planking and steel stringers of the flight deck, continued downward through 3 decks of interior structure, and detonated below the waterline. 35 men killed instantly. The explosion cracked frame C202 along the ship's bottom structure and admitted seawater into 2 void tanks and 1 fuel oil tank, giving Enterprise a slight port list. Not catastrophic, not a flooding casualty that threatened the ship, but 35 men dead and the whole integrity compromised in a way that damage control parties were still working against when the next bombs fell. 30 seconds later. The log timing is precise on this. Petty Officer Tomasatsu Akimoto's bomb struck the flight deck, approximately 15 feet from the first hit. This was a 241 kilograms high explosive bomb fitted with a contact fuse, rather than a delayed action fuse. The classification is a 241 kilograms Type 98 land bomb. The Bureau of Ships War Damage reports filed in October of 1942. After Enterprise's Pearl Harbor repair period contains a technical appendix that identifies this ordnance and then carries beside the entry a hand-stamped notation from a naval ordnance analyst. Wrong bomb type for target. The contact fuse detonated the bomb the moment it struck the wooden flight deck, before the casing could penetrate into the armored interior. The explosion killed 35 gunners in the adjacent 5-in gun gallery, 35 more men in the same breath as the notation, and ignited the ready service powder charges stored in open metal trays beside the gun mounts. Each charge was roughly 30 pounds of propellant. There were 12 charges per mount. The resulting secondary explosion was the equivalent of detonating more than 1,400 pounds of propellant in an enclosed gallery roughly 40 feet long. The fire that erupted was visible from every ship in the task force. About 8 minutes after that, at 16:46, according to Enterprise's log, a third bomb struck the flight deck forward of the first 2 hits. This was also a 241 kilograms land bomb dropped by Petty Officer Kazumi Horia. It hit the flight deck and detonated on contact. 10 feet hole in the deck planking. No penetration into the armored hangar structure below. No casualties beyond those already killed. The contact fuse designed for use against shore installations and unarmored targets had done exactly what it was designed to do. Produced a surface blast, which was precisely the wrong response for attacking a Yorktown-class carrier whose most critical internal system sat behind the armored hangar deck below. The attack was over at 16:48. 19 seconds separated the first hit from the third. 250 kilograms of the right bomb type punched through to the hull. 2 bombs of the wrong type detonated on a wooden surface. The ordnance confusion is not a minor technical footnote. It speaks to something important about how the Japanese attack was planned, or perhaps more accurately how it wasn't. The D-3A dive bombers attacking Enterprise carried a mixed load. Some aircraft armed with semi-armor-piercing bombs, others with high-explosive land bombs. This mixed loading suggests there was no unified targeting doctrine for the attack, no specific decision made at the air group level that we are attacking a carrier. Therefore, all aircraft carry semi-armor-piercing ordnance. Whether this was a supply limitation, a planning oversight, or a deliberate hedge against uncertain target identification, is something the available Japanese operational records don't fully clarify. What the records do clarify through the Bureau of Ships Analysis is that the 2 bombs best suited for destroying a carrier's interior structure, the semi-armor-piercing delayed action type, were outnumbered 2-1 in the ordnance that actually hit Enterprise. The ship survived in part because 2 of the 3 bombs that hit her were, by the Navy's own post-battle assessment, the wrong tool for the job. 7 D-3s broke off from the Enterprise attack and turned toward the battleship USS North Carolina, attempting secondary attacks on the battleship's larger hull. All 7 were shot down by the task force's combined anti-aircraft fire or by Wildcats that had finally reached fighting altitude. Enterprise's combat air patrol losses to American anti-aircraft fire remain one of the more uncomfortable data points from this engagement. Enterprise's own action report acknowledges the probability of at least 2 Wildcat fighters downed by friendly fire from the task force's guns. Eric Hamill's carrier clash, the most detailed operational reconstruction of the Eastern Solomons battle, suggests the number may have been as high as 4. No official casualty board ever adjudicated the question, because all 4 pilots were listed as killed in action regardless of the specific projectile that killed them. The Navy in 1942 didn't have a bureaucratic category for killed by our own anti-aircraft fire while defending the fleet. The tactical chaos of those 19 seconds produced casualties that the paperwork couldn't quite account for. At 16:48, the surviving Japanese aircraft reassembled in small groups and turned north. Enterprise was on fire in her gun gallery. She was listing slightly to port. Her power was intermittent. The bomb damage had partially disrupted the electrical systems that ran everything from the radar to the damage control phones to the lighting in the below-deck spaces, where repair parties were now working in near darkness. She was, to any observer on the horizon, a damaged ship. The Japanese pilots who saw her from the air, as they turned away, reported to carriers heavily damaged and burning. They reported what the smoke and fire told them. They didn't know what the Bureau of Ships Ordnance Analysts would later stamp on the damage assessment. They didn't know about the armored hangar deck. They didn't know about the pre-cut lumber. They flew north and filed their reports, and those reports said they had struck a decisive blow. They believed it. It was a reasonable thing to believe. Enterprise's damage control officer, Lieutenant Commander Herschel Smith, had his repair parties moving before the last bomb hit the deck. The ship's damage control architecture divided the response into separate parties, assigned to specific types of emergencies in specific zones. Repair Party Alpha for the flight deck craters, Repair Party Bravo for the gun gallery fire, Repair Party Charlie for the below-deck flooding from the first hit. 3 simultaneous emergencies, 3 separate parties, all managed from Damage Control Central through a sound-powered telephone circuit that was by this point partially non-functional. Smith's Battle Report, one of the most technically precise documents produced by any naval officer during the Guadalcanal campaign, describes the coordination with a specificity that makes you understand why the outcome was what it was. This wasn't improvisation. This was a drilled response to scenarios. The crew had practiced with equipment pre-stage, specifically because someone had thought about this possibility before it happened. The gun gallery fire required coater flooding of the enclosed space to extinguish burning propellant. That water alone would not stop. And in one of those quiet, devastating decisions that the operational record preserves without comment, the officer commanding Repair Party Bravo ordered the coater flooding, knowing that personnel might still be alive inside the gallery. 2 men were killed by asphyxiation during the firefighting operation. They're listed in the medical officer's casualty log as asphyxiation during firefighting operations. Not killed by the bomb, killed by the repair. The repair party officer who gave that order doesn't appear anywhere else in the official record. No citation, no court of inquiry, no documented recognition of what he'd been asked to decide. He made the operationally correct call. The record doesn't tell us anything about what it cost him to make it at 1746. By Enterprise's official log, 1 hour after the last bomb hit, flight operations resumed. The first aircraft actually landed at 1752, 6 minutes later. Depending on which document you consult and what definition of resumed operations you apply. The flight deck craters had been patched with pre-cut sections of teak and yellow pine planking, drawn from stores in the hangar bay, planking that had been pre-staged there as a standard readiness item after Coral Sea, because someone had learned, at the cost of Yorktown's damage, that carriers should carry their own repair lumber. The patch wasn't perfect. It wasn't rated for full flight operations under ideal conditions. It was rated for exactly what it needed to be rated for. Good enough to recover aircraft on the afternoon of the 24th of August, 1942, after 3 Japanese bombs had tried to stop it from ever recovering aircraft again. At 185, the Saratoga Strike Force returned from sinking Ryujo and landed without major incident. Enterprise was still in the fight. Chapter 7. The air group that vanished at 16:25 on the 24th of August, 1942. With Japanese dive bombers already appearing as a solid return on Enterprise's radar scope, and the task force bracing for the attack it had been dreading since dawn, both carriers did something that sounds almost counterintuitive. They launched aircraft, not a strike with a target, not a defensive patrol with a vector. They pointed aircraft at the sky and told their pilots in rough terms to fly north, attack whatever they found and not come back until it was safe to land. The operational logic was sound. A carrier deck full of fueled and armed aircraft is among the most dangerous places in the world. When enemy bombs start falling, and getting those aircraft airborne was a matter of basic survival. But the practical result was approximately 50 aircraft now orbiting over an empty ocean, with no mission, no target designation, and no coordinated plan, while the ship they just left was being hit by bombs below them. What happened to those aircraft over the next 3 hours constitutes one of the most genuinely chaotic and human dimensions of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, and it almost never makes it into the standard operational narratives. These weren't the Saratoga strike that found and sank Ryujo. These weren't the combat air patrol fighters who tried and partially failed to intercept the Japanese dive bombers. These were the aircraft in between, the ones holding armed weapons with no specific target, listening to their radio circuits dissolve into noise, watching smoke rise from Enterprise on the southern horizon, and making individual decisions about what to do next. Most of them couldn't do much. The geometry of the situation. Aircraft scattered over hundreds of square miles of ocean with no coherent communication, no updated target picture, and fuel states running down didn't leave a lot of options. But some of them found something. Lieutenant Commander Lewis Kerner commanded Saratoga's Scouting Squadron 3, and when I referenced his post-battle debriefing transcript against the standard operational summaries of Eastern Solomons. The contrast was genuinely striking. The operational summaries give him 2 paragraphs. His actual transcript runs to 3 pages. In it, he describes flying north after the deck clearing launch, receiving no orders following departure, making an independent navigation decision, and at approximately 1810, sighting a large enemy surface formation that he identified as heavy cruisers, lighter vessels, and what appeared to be a seaplane tender. His transcript notes, "No orders received after launch at 16:25. Used my own judgment. Proceeded north. Sighted large enemy surface formation. At approximately 1810 attacked the seaplane tender." 3 pages to describe a decision that in any rational institutional assessment was exactly what an aviator was supposed to do. The length of his report is the tell. He was writing like a man who expected to be asked uncomfortable questions. The formation Kana found was Vice Admiral Kondo's advanced force, 5 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 5 destroyers, and the seaplane tender, Chitose. The seaplane tender was unarmored, slower than the warships, and carrying approximately 12 Kawanishi H-8K flying boats and 12 Aichi E-13E float planes on her handling deck. Kana had 2 SPD Dauntless dive bombers, 2 aircraft against a formation of roughly 15 major warships. The Dauntless dive bombers attacked from altitude, probably somewhere above 10,000 feet given their fuel state and time airborne, pushing over in the standard 70 attack dive, releasing at roughly 2,500 feet, 2 bombs, both near misses on Cheetos. The Japanese damage report records both detonations, as within approximately 15 feet of the hull. At that range, against an unarmored vessel, a near miss from a 500-pound general-purpose bomb isn't a miss. It's a pressure wave that travels through water and into steel plating with enough force to crack welds, buckle frames, and admit seawater through joints, never designed to handle that kind of shock loading. Cheetos took on approximately 900 tons of water through the structural damage from those 2 near misses. She lost power to her port engine room. She had to be towed. An embarrassment for any warship to truck for repairs that wouldn't be completed until the 14th of September. The aircraft she was carrying, the flying boats and float planes that constituted Japan's long-range maritime reconnaissance capability in the Central Solomons were rendered inoperable. In the weeks that followed Eastern Solomons, when Tanaka was running the first Tokyo Express destroyer supply missions down the slot toward Guadalcanal, the reduced reconnaissance coverage from the damaged Cheetos's loss of aircraft meant fewer Japanese eyes over the approaches. The damage Kana's to aircraft inflicted in roughly 90 seconds of actual attack time had consequences that rippled outward for weeks. It's the kind of proportional return on investment that makes the absence of any combination in his record genuinely puzzling. There is a timing discrepancy in the records that I want to address directly rather than smooth over, because it's the kind of honest archival friction that matters. Kana's transcript states he attacked at 1810. The Japanese Cheetos damage report times the attack at 1752, an 18-minute difference. Kana was flying over open ocean with a knee pad for his navigation notes. The Dauntless had an open cockpit, and pilot notes routinely suffered water damage from spray and maneuver. His time may have been an estimate. The Japanese time may reflect when the damage was first logged, rather than when the bombs actually fell. I can't resolve it. The sources conflict. What's not in dispute is the damage itself, which the Japanese records document in precise engineering terms that don't leave room for ambiguity about whether the attack happened. The rest of the clear decks aircraft had a considerably less eventful afternoon. Most spent 2 to 3 hours airborne in a large holding pattern north and west of the task force, monitoring a radio circuit that was by turn silent and cacophonous, watching the smoke column from Enterprise rise and then gradually thin as the damage control parties brought the fires under control. Some flew north looking for targets and found nothing. Some encountered the surviving Japanese aircraft from the first attack wave, heading home, and exchanged inconclusive fire. Several ran their fuel states down to the point where Henderson Field on Guadalcanal became the only viable option. and they landed on the Coral and PSP Strip during the late afternoon and early evening, joining the Cactus Air Force's already crowded flight line. The Henderson Field landing log for the 24th through 25th of August records aircraft from both Saratoga and Enterprise touching down throughout the evening, a detail that appears in almost no carrier battle account, but that has a quiet operational significance. The carriers had essentially loaned Henderson Field a temporary air group. Among the aircraft that diverted to Henderson Field were several TBF Avengers with their Mark 13 torpedoes still armed. There was in August of 1942 no standard procedure for safely derming a live Mark 13 aerial torpedo in field conditions. The Avengers were parked at the end of Henderson Field's runway on an area strip that was itself being intermittently shelled by Japanese destroyers at night, with armed weapons aboard for approximately 14 hours while Marine ordnance crews worked out what to do with them. The ordnance manual for the Mark 13 was by all accounts not optimized for tropical fieldwork by personnel who hadn't specifically trained on that weapon. They sorted it out, but the image of armed torpedo bombers sitting at the end of a contested jungle airfield overnight, while their pilots slept in marine foxholes nearby, is the kind of operational detail that gets erased in the clean lines of tactical summaries, and it shouldn't be. The broader significance of the cleared decks aircraft, the current attack, the Henderson Field diversions, the armed Avengers overnight is what it says about the gap between organized carrier operations and the reality of combat. The battle plans drawn up in the operations rooms aboard Enterprise and Saratoga envision coordinated strikes, specific targets, clear chains of communication, and aircraft returning to their carriers in orderly fashion. What actually happened on the afternoon of the 24th of August was something considerably messier. Aircraft scattered across 200 meters of ocean making individual decisions, finding targets by chance, running low on fuel, and landing wherever they could. The outcome was still operationally positive. Kana's attack on Cheetos was genuinely consequential, and the Henderson Field diversion kept aircraft available for the following morning, but it was positive in spite of the disorder rather than because of any plan. That's not a failure. That's war. It's just not the version that fits neatly in an operational summary. Chapter 8. Abe's Gamble and the Midnight Reversal. In the archives of the US Naval Technical Mission to Japan, the team that spent 1945 and 1946 systematically documenting captured Japanese naval records, before most of them were destroyed or dispersed, there is a navigational track chart for one of the destroyer's screening Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe's Vanguard Force. The chart covers the 24th of August, 1942. The course line runs south-southeast for most of the day and evening, steady and purposeful. A destroyer moving at battle speed toward a position roughly 200 meters north of the American carrier task forces. Then at approximately 2,350, the line turns. Not a gradual change of course, a sharp turn to the northeast. Beside it, in the navigator's hand, Tetty withdrawal. The pen pressure, the Naval Technical Mission's analysts noted in their report, was noticeably heavier than the surrounding entries. The navigator was drawing in a hurry in the dark on a ship that had just changed everything about its immediate future. What was behind Abe's Vanguard Force that night, sailing south to meet it, was arguably the most powerful surface force Japan had deployed in the South Pacific at that point in the war. Tokongo-class battle cruisers, Hai and Kiroshima, reconstructed in the 1930s as fast battleships, each carrying 814 guns in 4 twin turrets capable of sustained speeds of roughly 30 knots, 3 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, 6 destroyers. The combined broadside weight of just the 2 battleships was approximately 400 pounds of steel per salvo, meaning that if they found Enterprise damaged, slowed, and partially powerless in the darkness south of Guadalcanal, the engagement would not have been a battle in any conventional sense. It would have been an execution. Abe also had Kondo's advanced force moving on a parallel track, 5 more heavy cruisers, a light cruiser, additional destroyers. Together, The combined Japanese surface force steaming south through the night of the 24th was by any measure of raw firepower sufficient to destroy whatever remained afloat. After the day's air fighting, the question that the track chart's sharp turn at 2,350 poses is therefore one of the most consequential in the entire Eastern Solomon story. Why did they stop? The official reasons recorded in AB's force action report cite three factors: loss of contact with American forces, the carriers had retired south, and Japanese floatplane scouts launched from the cruisers had failed to relocate them, fuel consumption at operational limits for sustained high-speed transit, and the threat of air attack at dawn from Henderson Field's aircraft, which would find the surface force exposed in daylight within range of Guadalcanal. These are rational military reasons. Taken together, they amount to a sensible commander deciding that the calculus of risk and reward had shifted against him during the night. But there is a fourth factor that Abe's report doesn't explicitly state, and that the Japanese naval historian Masanori Itoto examined in his post-war account of the Imperial Japanese Navy's decline. The ghost of Midway. Abe had not been at Midway personally, but every senior officer in August of 1942 was operating within the institutional trauma of what had happened there in June. For fleet carriers lost in a single afternoon to American dive bombers that found them with their decks crowded with aircraft, their crews caught between operations. The lesson that had been driven into the Jun's collective command consciousness, sometimes explicitly, sometimes through the unspoken change in how flag officers talked about carrier operations, was this surface forces should not operate without adequate air cover. And here was Abe deep in the night with Nogumo's carriers, having just lost dozens of aircraft in the day's fighting and now retreating north, moving his surface forces toward a position that dawn would find exposed and uncovered. The rational calculation and the institutional conditioning pointed the same direction. He turned round. The practical consequences of that midnight reversal were not immediately apparent to either side, but they became clear over the following hours. Tanaka's convoy, the three transport ships carrying 1,411 soldiers of the 28th Ichiki Regiment, plus naval landing force troops, was still moving toward Guadalcanal. It had been advancing under the assumption that the carrier battle had gone well. Based on the overcounted pilot reports flowing back to Japanese command, it had no surface force protection beyond its own escorting destroyers, and as it closed to within roughly 150 nautical miles of Guadalcanal in the early morning hours of the 25th of August, it was moving into the range of Henderson Field's aircraft without the covering umbrella that Abe's vanguard was supposed to provide. At 085 on the 25th, 18 aircraft from Henderson Field found Tanaka's convoy. The flagship light cruiser Jinsu was hit and severely damaged. 24 of her crew were killed. The blast knocked Tanaka himself unconscious and threw him against a bulkhead with enough force to give him a concussion that left him temporarily unable to command. The troop transport Kinryu Maru was hit by several bombs and sank as the destroyer Mutsuki came alongside Kinryu Maru to begin rescuing the embarked troops from the water. 4 B-17 heavy bombers from Espiritu Santo arrived overhead. The B-7 South were flying at high altitude, somewhere above 20,000 feet, conducting the kind of high-altitude level bombing that had been largely ineffective against maneuvering warships throughout the Pacific War against a stationary destroyer occupied with rescue operations. It was different. 5 bombs landed on or around Motsuki. She sank within minutes, taking 40 of her crew with her. An old destroyer. She was a Motsuki-class ship commissioned in 1927, destroyed by Army Air Forces bombers, doing exactly what the theorists said couldn't be done with high-altitude level bombing against naval targets. The Mitsuki sinking deserves more analytical attention than it receives. She became on the 25th of August, 1942, the first Japanese destroyer sunk exclusively by high-altitude heavy bomber attack. In the Pacific War, the Army Air Forces took note immediately. General Henry Arnold cited Motsuki's sinking in a briefing to the Joint Chiefs within weeks, arguing it as evidence that strategic bombers could wage naval warfare. without the Navy's carrier force. The Navy was deeply earnest by this argument, and the inner service politics that followed were predictably unpleasant. But the underlying operational fact that Henderson Field's combined air power, including Army B-7 operating from a Spirit Center, could interdict Japanese surface forces, even without carrier support, was exactly the lesson that Abe had been trying to avoid having to learn at personal cost. Tanaka transferred from the wrecked Jinsu to the destroyer Kagara with a bruised head, and what he described in his memoir as a bruised spirit. He assembled his surviving ships, the remaining destroyers, the troops still aboard them, the supplies that hadn't been lost with Kenryumaru, and took them northwest to the Japanese base in the Shortland Islands. The Guadalcanal garrison would not receive its 1,400 soldiers that day. It would not receive them that week. The convoy system that Japan had planned to use for reinforcement had been demonstrated in a single morning to be inoperable against a defended airfield within bombing range. Abe's midnight reversal and the next morning's catastrophe were the same strategic event, separated by 8 hours. The surface force turned away. The convoy was destroyed. The airfield held. What the track chart in the Naval Technical Missions Archives captures in that single, heavy pinstroke at 2,350 is the moment when air power converted into sea control without firing a gun. Abe didn't turn around because he was defeated. He turned around because he calculated correctly that continuing south meant operating in daylight, without air covering range of land-based aircraft from an airfield that had just demonstrated it could sink ships. The carrier battle of the 24th had given Henderson Field's aircraft, not the carrier aircraft specifically, but the combined air threat centered on the island, enough credibility to make a Japanese admiral with 2 battleships and 9 cruisers decide that the numbers didn't add up. That's not a tactical outcome. That's a strategic one. The battle was over. The war for Guadalcanal had at least 23 more weeks to run. Chapter 9. The letters that didn't arrive. There is a casualty notification report in the records at the National Archives that lists a gunner's mate 3rd class who served aboard USS Enterprise. His death date is recorded as the 24th of August, 1942. Cause killed in action. Bomb explosion. 5 in gun gallery. Starboard, aft. His next of kin contact is listed as his mother at a residential address in Woonsocket, Rhode Island. The notification was postmarked the 9th of September, 1942, 16 days after he died. For 16 days, while the battle reports were being written and the damage assessments filed and the repair schedules drawn up, his mother didn't know. She was going about her life, whatever a September morning in Woonsocket looked like in 1942. The milk bottles on the step, the neighbor's radio through the window, and her son was already gone. The Navy's administrative machinery needed 16 days to tell her. I want to hold that detail for a moment before moving into the mechanics of what happened in Gun Gallery 3 on the afternoon of the 24th of August. Because the mechanics, the ordnance types, the structural geometry, the damage control decisions are the framework, not the content. The content is the 35 men who were standing at their guns in that gallery when Petty Officer Emoto's 241 kilograms bomb hit the flight deck 15 feet from the first crater. The Bureau of Ships structural diagram for USS Enterprise shows Gun Gallery 3 as an enclosed sponson on the starboard aft quarter of the ship roughly 40 feet long, housing 4 of the ship's 5 in 38 caliber dual-purpose gun mounts. The crews who served those mounts were among the men trying to shoot down the dive bombers. Before the dive bombers shot them, they were still firing when the bomb hit. The 5 in 38 was a superb weapon, arguably the finest all-purpose naval gun of the Second World War, capable of firing 15 to 22 rounds per minute in the hands of a trained crew, with an effective ceiling against aircraft of roughly 37,000 feet. The gun crews aboard Enterprise on the 24th of August were trained crews. They had been at their stations since the radar contact was called at 162. They had been firing since before the first bomb hit. The rate of fire from Enterprise's anti-aircraft battery during the 19-minute attack was high enough that several Japanese aircraft were shot down before completing their dives. These men were doing their job at the moment the bomb killed them. What killed them specifically wasn't entirely the bomb. It was the secondary explosion from the ready service powder charges stored in open metal trays beside the gun mounts. Standard Navy doctrine in 1942 required ready service ammunition to be kept in closed metal lockers, individual containers that could be slammed shut in an emergency to contain any ignition. But in the operational tempo of a battle that had been building since 0935 that morning, with gun crews at stations for 6 hours, with the alert level at its highest and every second of loading time mattering, the crew had done what crews under pressure do. They'd opened the lockers during the alert phase for faster access, and left the charges in open trays where hands could reach them quickly. It was a common shortcut. It was the kind of small procedural deviation that accumulates quietly in every military operation, and occasionally produces catastrophic consequences. Each charge was approximately 30 pounds of propellant, 12 per mount, 4 mounts. The math of what detonating all of them simultaneously in an enclosed space does to the people inside that space requires no further elaboration. After Eastern Solomons, the Navy issued a fleet instructions specifically prohibiting open ready service ammunition storage during aircraft alerts. The instruction exists in the record because of what happened in Gun Gallery 3. The 35 men who died there are in an administrative sense the reason that instruction was written. Naval doctrine in wartime is often written in that specific currency. The cost of learning something that a training manual hadn't previously specified, paid in lives. I don't say that to be callous. I say it because it's important to understand that the knowledge encoded in a doctrinal change is not abstract. It was purchased from specific people at a specific place in time. Enterprise's official casualty reports filed in the immediate aftermath of the battle listed 74 killed. The Bureau of Medicine and Surgery's subsequent review revised the total to 90 killed. The additional 16 men were those who survived the attack itself, but died of their wounds aboard Enterprise or at medical facilities during the transit to Pearl Harbor. Navy administrative practice in 1942 did not distinguish between killed in action and died of wounds. For next-of-kin notification purposes, the notification form sent to families listed the 24th of August as the date of death for all 90 men, regardless of when they actually died. The families of the 16 men who survived long enough to potentially write a final letter, to say something to someone, or to be conscious of what was happening to them, those families received notifications that said their sons and husbands and brothers died on the same afternoon as the men killed instantly in the gun gallery. The administrative fiction of a single death date erased 2 weeks of suffering from the official record as cleanly as a typed entry on a form. Several Saratoga aircrew killed during the day's operations were buried in the ground on Guadalcanal rather than at sea, because their aircraft had gone down on or near Henderson Field rather than over open water. Their families were notified that they were buried at sea, the standard notification for aviators lost over the Pacific. The Marine Corps' graves registration records for Henderson Field in August and September of 1942 list these men by name, and the discrepancy between where they actually lie and what their families were told is one of those archival inconsistencies that sits in the records without resolution. The families were told what the Navy's standard notification protocol produced. The records know something different. The 7 American aircrew killed in the Eastern Solomons battle are a number that appears in virtually every account, usually in a sentence that notes the asymmetry with Japan's 61 experienced aircrew lost. 7 versus 61. The asymmetry is real and it matters strategically, and the following chapters will explain why at considerable length. But before the strategic ledger, I want to note something specific about those 7 men. They were all aviators, pilots or aircrew members of the Strike and Combat Air Patrol aircraft. They died over the ocean, Most of them were not recovered. The Pacific in 1942 didn't distinguish between a pilot who died in combat and one who survived a water landing only to drown before a rescue vessel arrived. Both were entered in the record as killed in action. The distinction between dying in the act of fighting and dying in the aftermath of it, between the combat death and the drowning in the dark, is the kind of distinction the paperwork couldn't hold. The 90 American dead from Eastern Solomons include men killed by Japanese bombs, men killed by American anti-aircraft fire, men killed by coastal flooding during firefighting operations, men who died of wounds during the transit to Pearl Harbor, and men who drowned in the ocean north of the Santa Cruz Islands. The record holds all of them under the same category. History treats the battle as a tactical success, which it was. The tactical success and the 90 deaths are both true simultaneously. And the temptation, the narrative pressure in any war documentary, is to let the success absorb the deaths, to make the deaths the price of the success and therefore comprehensible, contained. What I keep returning to when I look at those casualty notification forms is that the men filling out those forms and the men receiving them didn't have the benefit of the strategic retrospect that we carry into this story. They just had a name on a form and a date. That's where the history actually lives. Chapter 10. Damage Control at 17 knots. The Damage Control Central Log for USS Enterprise entry at 16:47. 1 minute after the last bomb hit, reads in its entirety, DC Central has control. All repair parties report. Fire forward controlled. Fire aft gun gallery active. Flooding C202F. Flooding C305W. List 1.5 ports. Then nothing for 4 minutes. The next entry at 16:51 list correction underway. Flooding C202F isolated repair party Alpha. In bomb crater number 1. Those 4 silent minutes in the log aren't a gap in the record. They're what the record looks like when every person in Damage Control Central is on a sound-powered telephone or shouting through a speaking tube instead of writing entries. The log resumes when someone's hands were free again. Lieutenant Commander Herschel Smith had been Enterprise's damage control officer long enough to have drilled his repair parties through the specific scenarios that on the afternoon of the 24th of August stopped being scenarios. His battle report filed as part of the larger War Damage Report October 1942 is one of the most technically precise documents produced by any damage control officer. In the Pacific War, it describes in the dry language of engineering reports the simultaneous management of 3 separate emergency situations by 3 separate repair parties, operating in degraded conditions, partial power loss, intermittent communications, smoke and heat in the compartments adjacent to the bomb damage, and the ongoing structural uncertainty about whether the flooding from the first hit would continue to spread or had been contained by the isolation of frame C202. Smith was managing all 3 situations from a position that had at that precise moment less reliable information than any of the repair parties actually on the scene. Repair Party Bravo had the hardest problem. The gun gallery fire was fed by burning powder propellant, not a fire that water suppresses effectively. Water on burning naval propellant produces a steam explosion that can be more destructive than the original fire. The standard response to a burning magazine or ready service ammunition fire aboard a naval vessel was coated flooding of the enclosed space, pumping carbon dioxide into the compartment until the oxygen concentration dropped below the threshold required for combustion. This worked. It also created an immediately lethal atmosphere for anyone inside the space. The repair party officer on scene had to make the call, flood the compartment, and extinguish the fire, accepting that any personnel remaining inside would not survive the atmosphere, without complete knowledge of whether the space had been fully evacuated. 2 men died from asphyxiation in that gallery during the Kota flooding. They're in the medical officer's log. They're not in any combination record. The flooding problem from the first bomb hit, the semi-armor-piercing delayed action round that had punched through to below the waterline, was being managed by Repair Party Charlie working in the double-bottom void tank spaces, which meant working in near-total darkness in compartments that were actively taking water with sound-powered telephone circuits that were intermittently non-functional due to the electrical damage. The Yorktown-class design had anticipated exactly this kind of scenario in its compartmentalization architecture. The 14 FT void tanks running along the double bottom were what naval architects call sacrificial spaces. Their flooding was the designed absorption mechanism for underwater hits. Frame C202 had cracked, and the adjacent tanks had flooded on schedule, so to speak. The critical task was ensuring the flooding stopped at the design boundary, rather than propagating through damaged bulkheads into fuel oil tanks and machinery spaces. Repair Party Charlie isolated the flooding compartments by closing and dogging the relevant watertight hatches, while simultaneously counter-flooding the starboard void tanks to correct the port list. This required adding approximately 1,200 tons of water carefully on the right side in the right tanks while simultaneously pumping water out of the flooded port spaces. Getting this wrong by even a modest margin would give Enterprise a permanent list that compromised flight deck operations. The counter-flooding operation achieved 0.8 of neutral trim. This number appears in Smith's damage control report as a straightforward technical result. What it represents operationally is a team of men managing weight distribution on a 25,000-ton ship to within roughly 50 tons of optimum in the dark, using hand-operated valves and partially functional instruments while the ship was still at high speed and while other fires and flooding casualties were being simultaneously managed throughout the vessel. The Newport News Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company's engineers had dimensioned those void tanks in 1934 based on calculated underwater explosion scenarios. Their math was right. The design worked. Enterprise's structural designers working with slide rules in a drawing office 15 years before the battle had built the margin that Smith's repair parties were now exploiting. The flight deck repair is the element that gets the most narrative attention in most accounts, and it deserves it, though usually for the wrong reason. The usual framing emphasizes the speed of the repair, 1 hour from last bomb hit to resumed flight operations, as a testament to crew skill and determination. It was those things, but the enabling factor that made the speed possible was a pre-staged material supply that had nothing to do with courage and everything to do with institutional learning. After the Battle of the Coral Sea in May of 1942, during which USS Yorktown took a bomb hit that damaged her flight deck, the Navy had identified flight deck planking repair as a likely requirement in carrier combat, and had added pre-cut sections of teak and yellow pine planking to the standard readiness stores aboard fleet carriers. Enterprise's hangar bay contained those pre-cut sections. When Repair Party Alpha reached the bomb craters and radioed back their dimensions, the working party below in the hangar was already cutting additional pieces to fit. The lumber was ready because someone who had studied Coral Sea had decided it should be. That kind of institutional learning, specific material, unglamorous is the actual mechanism by which militaries get better at fighting, and it operates almost invisibly below the level of heroic narrative. The 5-in-38 gun mounts in the damaged gallery were a separate problem. 2 of the 4 mounts in the gallery had been destroyed or put out of action by the bomb blast and secondary explosion. The remaining 2 were structurally intact but surrounded by debris in a compartment that had just been flooded with CO2 and still smelled of burned propellant and scorched metal. Smith's report notes that by 17:30, 44 minutes after the last bomb hit, all surviving gun mounts had been inspected and those capable of operation were returned to readiness. The word surviving is doing a lot of work in that sentence. The gun crews for the destroyed mounts were dead or wounded. The crews for the surviving mounts were in several documented cases drawn from men whose stations had been destroyed, who were reassigned on the spot by the gun officer. The operational continuity of the anti-aircraft battery in the 44 minutes after the attack was maintained by men who had just watched their shipmates die at adjacent positions. Enterprise resumed flight operations at depending on which document you use, somewhere between 1740 and 1752 on the 24th of August, 1942. The Saratoga strike returned from sinking Ryujo and landed at 185. The second wave of Japanese aircraft 927 D3 had approached the task force at approximately 1815, but failed to locate the carriers and turned back. 5 of those aircraft were lost to operational mishaps on the return flight to their carriers. Enterprise's ship's company had in approximately 78 minutes gone from a vessel on fire and listing with 3 bomb craters in her flight deck to a fully operational carrier recovering aircraft in the early evening light south of the Solomon Islands. Smith's damage control report ends with a brief section on lessons identified for wider dissemination. 3 of the 5 lessons he identified were subsequently incorporated into fleet-wide doctrine changes: the ready service ammunition storage prohibition, a revised counter-flooding protocol that specified cleared space confirmation requirements before flooding, and an updated counter-flooding procedure that formalized the weight distribution calculations his team had performed under improvised conditions. These changes appear in subsequent editions of the Naval Ship's Technical Manual. They don't carry Smith's name. They don't mention Enterprise. They're just the new standard, quietly reflecting an afternoon when the old standard proved insufficient. When I think about the actual long-term consequences of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons for the United States Navy, not the strategic consequences, not the carrier attrition, mathematics, but the specific institutional knowledge it produced, Smith's 3 doctrine changes are probably more durable than any tactical outcome of the battle. They're still in the manual. Chapter 11. What each side thought it had done. There's a SINCPAC intelligence summary dated the 26th of August, 1942 that sits in the operational archives and reads in the comm language of an intelligence officer, trying to reconcile 2 wildly different accounts of the same event. On one side, Japanese radio traffic monitored by American signals intelligence stations claiming that American losses included 2 carriers sunk, 1 battleship destroyed, and multiple cruisers and destroyers. The J in traffic specifically claimed that USS Hornet had been sunk, a claim that would have satisfied a particular institutional appetite at Combined Fleet Headquarters, since Hornet had launched the Dittle Raiders who bombed Tokyo in April. On the other side, Task Force 61's after-action report, which listed American losses as 1 carrier damaged, 20 aircraft destroyed, and 90 personnel killed. The intelligence summary stamps both sets of claims side by side, and the reader is left to reconcile them. Hornet was not at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. She was operating with a separate task force approximately 600 meters away. The Japanese in the controlled chaos of 30 dive bombers attacking through smoke and anti-aircraft fire had killed a ship that wasn't there. The American overcounting was less spectacular, but comparably disconnected from reality. Enterprise and Saratoga's Air Group U debriefing reports tallied approximately 70 Japanese aircraft shot down, the total number of Japanese aircraft in the first attacking wave. The only wave that actually attacked was 27 D3 dive bombers and 150 fighters, 42 aircraft. The Americans claimed more kills than there were aircraft to kill. The overmounting factor of approximately 1.9 to 1 was by the standards of air combat, in this period of the war fairly typical. Pilots operating at the extreme edge of their physical and psychological capacity, attacking and being attacked simultaneously, watching aircraft go down and not always knowing whether the aircraft they were watching was one they'd hit or one hit by someone else. The conditions of carrier air combat in 1942 were not conditions designed for precise accounting, but the American debriefing system included a collective interview process, where an intelligence officer cross-referenced individual pilot reports and attempted to eliminate duplicate claims before forwarding figures upward. The Japanese system didn't work that way. The Japanese after-action reporting protocol, the Sento Show system, required individual pilots to file written reports within 12 hours of a mission. These individual reports were aggregated by squadron commanders and forwarded upward through the chain of command without systematic cross-referencing to identify and eliminate double counting. If 3 pilots each reported hitting the same carrier and observing it burst into flames, 3 hits went into the aggregate tally rather than 1. This wasn't incompetence or dishonesty. It was a structural feature of an information processing system that had been designed for a different kind of war, one where pilots returned to a carrier, were debriefed one by one, and their reports were compiled over hours. In the operational tempo of the August 24th engagement, with dive bombers attacking through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, with aircraft taking hits and struggling to recover, with the entire attack sequence compressed into 19 minutes, the system produced numbers that bore only approximate relationship to physical reality. The overcounting ratio on the Japanese side was considerably worse than on the American side. The JN's official claims for Eastern Solomons, as reported to Imperial General Headquarters, included sinking or heavily damaging ships totaling roughly 87,000 tons of Allied naval tonnage. The actual Allied tonnage damaged approximately 19,800 tons, being Enterprise alone. The overcounting ratio was roughly 4.4 to 1. Japanese pilots reported to carriers burning and heavily damaged, where there was 1 carrier with controlled damage. They reported a battleship destroyed where North Carolina had been attacked unsuccessfully. They reported a Hornet-class carrier, Hornet herself, sunk when Hornet was nowhere near the engagement. The gap between the report and the reality was not a small rounding error. It was a fundamentally different picture of the same afternoon. The operational consequences of the Japanese overcounting were immediate and serious. Based on the pilot reports filtering back through the command chain to American carriers out of action, the way clear for Tanaka's convoy, Japanese headquarters ordered the convoy to resume its advance toward Guadalcanal. On the morning of the 25th of August, Tanaka's transports were sent forward toward an airfield that had not been neutralized, toward American surface forces that had not been destroyed, toward a situation that was, from his perspective on the bridge of Jinsu, not what the previous night's reports had described. The bombs that hit Kinryumaru, the attack that knocked Tanaka unconscious, the salvo from the B-17s that sank Mutsuki. These were not the actions of an enemy whose carriers had been destroyed. They were the actions of an enemy whose carriers had not been found, and whose Henderson Field aircraft were fully operational. The overcounted pilot reports had effectively told the Japanese that they'd won a battle. They hadn't won, and the soldiers aboard Kinryumaru paid part of the cost. The Hornet claim deserves its own specific examination because its administrative afterlife is one of the more quietly revealing episodes in Jain institutional history. The claim that Hornet had been sunk at Eastern Solomons was incorporated into the Jain's official record of the battle and used in domestic Japanese propaganda within 48 hours. 2 months later, at the Battle of Santa Cruz, on the 26th of October 1942, USS Hornet was actually sunk, struck by multiple bombs and torpedoes in a sustained Japanese attack. The JN now faced a documentary problem. Their official records showed Hornet already sunk in August. The post-war JN history compiled by the Japan Self-Defense Forces History Department in the 1950s and 60s resolves this discrepancy in a way I find almost endearingly bureaucratic. Eastern Solomons Hornet damaged, Santa Cruz Hornet sunk. The August claim was retroactively downgraded from sunk to damaged without any acknowledgement that the original report had said sunk. The institutional record quietly corrected itself without ever admitting it had been wrong. What the overcounting reveals on both sides in different magnitudes is something important about the epistemology of air combat in this period. The pilot in a dive bomber pushing over at 14,000 feet and pulling out below 2,000 feet is not in a position to conduct forensic assessment of the damage he's caused. He sees a hit, sees smoke and fire, and then he's pulling out of the dive with his vision graying from the G-force and turning to evade fighters coming down on him. What he reports is the last clear image he had before the dive physics took over his world. multiplied across 27 pilots, doing the same thing in sequence in a shared smoke and fire environment, reporting individually through a system with no cross-referencing mechanism. The overouting isn't a mystery. It's an arithmetic certainty. The American system caught more of it than the Japanese system did. Not all of it. The Americans claimed 70 aircraft when 42 were present, but enough of it to leave the American command picture substantially more accurate than its Japanese equivalent. The intelligence failure had a longer half-life on the Japanese side. SINCPAC's post-battle assessments working from the Task Force 61 reports and signals intelligence produced a reasonably accurate picture of Japanese losses. Within days of the engagement, the Japanese staff working from their own pilots' reports produced a picture that showed a major American defeat. These two institutional pictures of the same battle then shaped the planning and expectations of both sides for the weeks that followed. The Americans knew they'd won something, even if they weren't yet certain what. The Japanese believed they'd won something considerably larger than what had actually occurred. That belief, that overconfidence grounded in overcounted reports, drove the decision to resume the convoy, and the decision to believe the Guadalcanal operation was still broadly on track when it was already beginning to unravel along its most critical supply line. The overouting at Eastern Solomons didn't just misrepresent a battle, it helped mismanage a campaign. Chapter 12. The pilot who could not be replaced. There is a pre-war J&N training directive in the records captured by the US Naval Technical Mission to Japan, dated 1937, that sets the standard for carrier pilot qualification in language that is precise almost to the point of severity. Minimum 700 flight hours before carrier qualification itself, a minimum of 80 rested landings, daylight only, night carrier operations, qualification deferred until completion of 100 additional hours beyond that. The document was produced by the Bureau of Aeronautics, the institutional arm of the Japanese Navy responsible for naval aviation training and procurement, and it represents the accumulated thinking of an officer corps that had spent the 1920s and 30s building the finest naval air arm in the world from first principles. At the bottom of the document, in handwriting identified in the technical mission's annotation as that of a senior bureau officer, there is a notation: current strength, 765 qualified carrier pilots total fleet. That was the entire foundation of Japanese carrier air power. 765 men. I want to be precise about what that number means, because the temptation is to read it as small, and therefore as a Japanese planning failure. It wasn't small by the standards of 1937. The United States Navy's equivalent number in the same period was broadly comparable. Roughly 800 to 900 carrier-qualified aviators across the fleet. Both navies had built training pipelines optimized for the war, each expected to fight a relatively short decisive conflict in the Pacific, in which the quality advantage of each navy's best aviators would determine the outcome. In a series of concentrated engagements, neither navy had built a pipeline optimized for sustained attritional warfare over years, because in 1937, sustained attritional warfare over years wasn't the war anyone was planning. The difference between the two navies wasn't in 1937, it was in what happened in 1939 through 1941, when the United States expanded its naval aviation training program under the Naval Aviation Cadet Act and related legislation, and Japan did not make an equivalent commitment. The cumulative accounting of J&N carrier aircrew losses from Pearl Harbor through Eastern Solomons is not a number that appears in any single document, because it has to be assembled from multiple sources that don't always agree in their specifics. From the available records, the post-war USBS Aviation Statistics PD Sunburst Frank Guadalcanal, the rough shape of the loss profile is this. Pearl Harbor produced minimal aircrew loss, since most Japanese aircraft either returned to their carriers or ditched near recoverable positions. The Indian Ocean operation in April of 1942 was moderately costly. The Coral Sea took a significant bite. Perhaps 40 to 50 experienced aircrew from Zuikaku's air group killed or wounded in the carrier duel. Midway was catastrophic in aircraft, somewhat less so in pilot casualties than is commonly assumed because many carrier aircrew survived their carrier sinkings. Then Guadalcanal began and the attrition became relentless and cumulative. Land-based aviation losses in the rebel operations, aircrew expended in daily strikes down the slot, and now 61 carrier aircrew killed at Eastern Solomons in a single afternoon. The 61 figure, 27 from Shokaku, 21 from Zuikaku, and 13 from Ryujo, is the number that historians have used to argue that Eastern Solomons was more strategically significant than its immediate tactical results suggest. Richard Frank's case in Guadalcanal is the most rigorous version of this argument, that the steady reduction of Japan's experienced carrier aviator cadre, of which Eastern Solomons was a substantial installment, was the cumulative cause of Japanese carrier aviation's eventual inability to sustain combat operations. The argument has a compelling arithmetic logic. The JN's annual output of carrier-qualified pilots, roughly 100 to 150 per year under the pre-war program, could not numerically replace losses at the Coral Sea, Midway, and Eastern Solomons rate without running a substantial deficit in experienced personnel. By late 1942, the replacement rate and the loss rate had produced a situation where Japanese carrier air groups were being rebuilt with pilots averaging fewer than 300 flight hours in the cockpit. The training gap wasn't invisible to the Japanese Navy. The annotation in Zuikaku's August strength return, no real experience, wasn't written in secret. It was written in a document that passed through the operational chain. But the institutional response to that documented deficiency was constrained by a structural problem that the JN couldn't solve quickly. Expanding the training program required diverting aviation gasoline, instructor pilots, training aircraft, and airfield construction resources away from the operational fleet, and toward a training establishment whose output wouldn't reach combat units for 18 months to 2 years. In a war the Japanese had planned to win within 18 months. Investing heavily in training for a war of longer duration was institutionally difficult to justify. Even when the need was clear, the Bureau of Aeronautics did initiate a training expansion program in late 1942, to limited, to late, but real. The evidence that prompted it included the Eastern Solomons losses. There is a specific mechanism in the JN's pilot replacement problem that tends to get summarized, rather than explained, and I think the explanation matters. When Zuikaku's air group lost approximately 46 aircraft at the Coral Sea in May of 1942, the aircraft were replaced from reserve stocks and new production within weeks. The airframes were fungible. When Shokaku and Zuikaku sailed for Eastern Solomons in August, their aircraft complement was rebuilt on paper to something approaching full strength. But the pilots who had been lost at Coral Sea, the ones who had accumulated their 700 flight hours over 2 to 3 years of training, who had qualified in arrested landings and weather and darkness, who knew from muscle memory how a D-3A behaved in a 70 dive at terminal velocity, those pilots were not replaced. Their seats were filled by men who'd had 273 average flight hours and had never been in a combat dive against an actual defended target. The aircraft numbers looked the same on the strength return. The capability they represented was not the same. This is the distinction that the casualty figures alone don't capture. At Eastern Solomons, the Japanese lost 61 aircrew. The Americans lost 7. That ratio, roughly 8.7 to 1, appears in every strategic summary of the battle, and it's accurate as far as it goes. But it doesn't capture the qualitative component of the Japanese losses, which is the part that mattered most. The Japanese air crew killed on the 24th of August included veterans of Pearl Harbor, men who had been at the Indian Ocean strikes in April, pilots who had accumulated thousands of flight hours against both trained and combat opposition. They were in the specific technical language of military manpower analysis, irreplaceable in the short term. The Americans lost 7 aircrew, who however individually skilled and courageous existed within a training and replacement system. that was already expanding to produce more. The United States Naval Aviation Cadet Program had already by August of 1940 begun the ramp-up that would eventually produce tens of thousands of qualified aviators. Japan's institutional capacity to replace what it lost at Eastern Solomons with equivalent quality was measured in years it didn't have. The longer arc of this attrition problem runs through every subsequent carrier engagement in the Pacific. At Santa Cruz in October of 1942, Shokaku and Zuikaku would again put their air groups against American carriers, and they would score significant hits. USS Hornet would be sunk, USS Enterprise would be damaged again, but the quality of the Japanese attacks at Santa Cruz, while competent, was measurably different from the quality of the Coral Sea attacks that had killed Lexington. The pilots were younger, less experienced, flying with the intensity of men who'd been told that attacking was the highest calling, but who hadn't yet acquired the precise spatial judgment that comes from hundreds of actual combat dives. By the Philippine Sea in June of 1944, what American aviators would call the Marianas Turkey Shoot, the gap between the JN's experienced aircrew from 1941 and the replacements available in 1944 had become so large that the outcome was effectively predetermined. Eastern Solomons was one installment in the payment plan for that outcome, not the only one, not the first one, but a significant one, charged at a moment when the JN's reserve of truly experienced carrier aviators had already been depleted by Coral Sea and Midway, and when the replacement pipeline was producing graduates, who by the annotation in their own carriers' records, the men who served alongside them knew were not yet ready. Chapter 13. The Tokyo Express is born. Ryujo Tanaka arrived at the Shortland Islands anchorage on the afternoon of the 25th of August 1942, aboard the destroyer Kagero, with a bandaged head and, in his own words, a bruised spirit. His flagship Jinsu was limping back toward True, with a wrecked forward section and 24 dead. The transport Kinryu Maru was on the bottom. The destroyer Mutsuki was on the bottom. 1,411 soldiers of the 28th Ichiki Regiment were still aboard destroyers, not on Guadalcanal, where they needed to be, but anchored in the Shortlands, which was the nearest Japanese base with a signals room and a jetty. Tanaka transferred to the base, walked into the communications room, and spent what he described as 3 hours trying to explain to Rabel why he had not reached Guadalcanal. He had not yet decided what to do next. The destroyers were still fueled. What Tanaka did next over the following days, in consultation with his staff and with the operational constraints imposed by Henderson Field's continuing existence as a functional airfield, produced one of the most consequential logistical improvisations in the Pacific War. He didn't invent it from nothing. The concept of using high-speed destroyers as troop and supply carriers had been discussed at 8th Fleet headquarters in Rabat before the convoy disaster of the 25th, but Tanaka took the concept from a contingency discussion and made it an operational reality, with specific procedures, specific timing, and a specific set of hard-learned lessons about what Henderson Field's aircraft could and couldn't intercept. The Allies would eventually give his operation a name, the Tokyo Express. Tanaka's own documentation refers simply to destroyer transport operations. The name his opponents gave it was more evocative. The operational concept had a specific geometry designed around the capabilities and limitations of the forces involved. The Fubuki class and related destroyer types available to Tanaka for the express runs were capable of sustained speeds of approximately 30 knots under combat conditions, which was the performance figure that made the entire concept viable. At 30 knots, a destroyer departing the Shortlands anchorage could reach the northern coast of Guadalcanal, roughly 300 nautical miles by the route through New Georgia Sound, the waterway the Allies called the Slot, in approximately 10 hours. Departing in the early afternoon, a destroyer would arrive off Guadalcanal around midnight, spend 1 to 2 hours offloading troops and supplies by small boat in darkness, and be back out of Henderson Field's effective strike range before dawn. Henderson Field's aircraft needed daylight to operate effectively against maneuvering fast warships. They needed time to spot, identify, and organize strikes. A destroyer that was gone before 0500 was substantially harder to intercept than a slow transport that plotted through the same waters over 16 hours. The supply capacity of the Express was its fundamental limitation, and Tanaka understood this clearly. Even as he was organizing the first runs, a single Fubuki-class destroyer had approximately 62 tons of usable cargo capacity, when loaded with troops sitting on every available deck surface, sleeping in passageways, occupying the torpedo handling areas and the wardroom, and every other space that could hold a human being. A typical transport of the class Japan had been using for conventional convoy operations. The Kinryumaru class carried approximately 4,500 tons of cargo. The Express replaced transport ships with destroyers at a cargo ratio of roughly 1:72. To deliver the equivalent of a single transport's load required 70 destroyer runs. In operational terms, to sustain a garrison of any significant size with adequate ammunition, food, medical supplies, and heavy equipment, the Tokyo Express would need to run constantly. And because the Fubuki-class destroyers burned fuel at roughly triple their economical cruise rate, when running at 30 knots, each run taxed the tanker and logistics infrastructure at the Shortland significantly. The first operational Tokyo Express run departed on the 29th of August, 1942. 6 destroyers carrying approximately 900 soldiers of the Eiki Regiment, the remainder of the regiment that had survived the fighting on Guadalcanal, and those waiting in the Shortlands, plus supplies loaded in watertight drums. The round trip took 17 hours. The destroyers arrived off Guadalcanal before midnight, discharged troops and supplies by small boat, and cleared the area before dawn without loss. 0 American aircraft intercepted them. The concept worked. The destroyers were fast enough, dark enough, and early enough to evade the daylight air threat from Henderson Field. What they couldn't solve was the supply mathematics. The garrison was receiving soldiers. It wasn't receiving the artillery, vehicles, engineering equipment, medical apparatus, and bulk ammunition stockpiles that a sustained ground campaign requires. Those things needed transport ships. Transport ships needed daylight, and calm seas, and time at anchor. Henderson Field made all 3 of those conditions dangerous. The Guadalcanal garrison would fight the entire campaign with what it had been able to bring before the 25th of August, plus whatever human bodies the Express could deliver, minus what it could carry in 62 tons per destroyer run. There is a specific detail in the Tokyo Express operations that doesn't appear in the standard tactical summaries, but that the supply records document with quiet precision. The drums offloaded offshore Guadalcanal, the watertight containers of rice, ammunition, and medical supplies floated from the destroyer's deck and pushed toward shore by the current, were not always recovered. The Japanese garrison troops on the beach were working in darkness, often sick with malaria or dysentery under intermittent artillery and air threat, trying to find floating drums in a dark tropical sea. The recovery rate for offloaded drums averaged by post-war analysis of the supply records, approximately 70 to 75% per run. Roughly a quarter of everything the Express delivered by the drum method never reached the garrison. Japanese command accepted this loss as the cost of the only delivery method that worked. The alternative was to send transport ships that would be sunk in daylight by aircraft, which produced a recovery rate of approximately 0. 75% was under the circumstances a triumph. The decision by Japanese command to accept the limitations of the Tokyo Express, to feed the Guadalcanal garrison through a pipeline that could deliver soldiers, but not the means to fight a modern campaign effectively, was made. Implicitly rather than explicitly, there was no staff conference that decided we will sacrifice heavy equipment in exchange for troop delivery speed. The decision was made by the facts on the ground, or more precisely, by the fact of the airfield on the ground, and the absence of any alternative that didn't involve losing more ships. What happened to Tanaka's convoy on the 25th of August demonstrated conclusively and immediately that daylight surface transit within range of Henderson Field was no longer viable. The Express was what was left. I keep returning to a single line in Tanaka's memoir when I think about this period. His description of sitting in the signals room at the Shortlands for 3 hours, with the wounded on his staff's minds and the sunk ships in recent memory, trying to compose an explanation for Rabiel. He notes that the destroyers were still fueled. That detail, the fueled destroyers sitting at anchor while he worked out what to do with them, captures the specific character of the problem he was solving. He didn't need to invent new ships. He didn't need to wait for reinforcements. He had the instruments for the next operation sitting in the harbor ready to move. He just needed to decide what the operation was. When he decided, the Tokyo Express followed almost immediately. The fastest and in some ways, most innovative naval logistics system of the Pacific War was born from a man with a bruised head and a fueled destroyer fleet and no other options. The downstream consequences of the Express for the Guadalcanal campaign, for the soldiers who were delivered by destroyer, and then fought without adequate artillery or supplies, for the campaign's eventual outcome were enormous, but they trace back to the 24th of August. The carrier battle that preserved Henderson Field is the direct operational cause of the conditions that made the Tokyo Express the only viable Japanese logistics option. Tanaka didn't create the Express because he was imaginative, though he was. He created it because the alternative, the conventional convoy, the slow transports, the daytime approach, had been demonstrated to be suicidal by the aircraft from an airfield that the Battle of the Eastern Solomons had kept in American hands. The Express was the answer to a problem that the carrier battle had created, and the Express, despite everything it delivered, could never deliver enough. Chapter 14. Henderson Field's borrowed time. There is an entry in the Henderson Field operations log for the 26th of August, 1940 to timed at 0645. That reads with the matter-of-fact terseness of a man who has been awake all night and doesn't have the energy for drama. 31 operational aircraft aviation gasoline, 17 drums remaining. Estimated today's operational supply requested emergency resupply by air request denied. Supply ship in transit. Estimated time of arrival, 72 hours. In the margin, penciled by someone whose handwriting the archivists have never formally identified. We have 5 missions left. 17 drums. At the consumption rate the Cactus Air Force was burning through fuel during those August operations. Roughly 3 drums per combat mission for a full scramble. The airfield that both navies had just fought a carrier battle to control had approximately 44 hours of combat aviation fuel on the morning after the engagement. Not 44 days, 44 hours. The physical reality of Henderson Field in late August of 1942 was one that the operational summaries and tactical histories tend to describe in terms that are accurate in their facts and somehow misleading in their cumulative impression. 3,778 feet of runway, coral and pierced steel planking surface, adequate in dry conditions, treacherous in rain. Drainage channels that the marine engineers had dug by hand were insufficient for the tropical downpours that rolled across Guadalcanal with little warning, and turned the coral surface into something approaching mud along its edges. The blast shelters, foxholes roofed with corrugated metal or captured Japanese lumber, provided minimal protection against anything larger than artillery fragments. There was no permanent aviation gasoline storage. The fuel supply arrived in 5 Gaul steel drums that were stacked in the open, at the edge of the flight line, exposed to direct sunlight that heated the contents throughout the day, and to the risk of a single Japanese artillery shell or strafing run setting off a chain reaction that could eliminate the field's operational capacity in one event. This was what both navies had been fighting over. The 1st Marine Aircraft Wings War Diary, for the period immediately following Eastern Solomon's documents with the specificity of men who understood exactly how precarious their situation was. The day-by-day fuel situation at Henderson Field. The pattern is consistent and alarming. Fuel arrives by whatever improvised means are available. A destroyer making a night run. An ancient Catalina flying boat that landed in Lunga Roads, with drums strapped to its external fittings. Once a submarine that runs surfaced at night with deck cargo, and is consumed within days by the operational tempo of a fighter force defending an active airfield against daily Japanese attacks from rabble. The Cactus Air Force was never more than a few days from running dry. It never actually ran dry. The margin was throughout August and September of 1940 to narrow enough to be described accurately as borrowed time. What the Battle of the Eastern Solomons contributed to Henderson Field's survival was not the destruction of Japanese offensive capacity, because it didn't accomplish that. Shokaku and Zuikaku were damaged in their air groups but not destroyed. The land-based bombers at Rabble continued flying south every day or two. What Eastern Solomons contributed was time. Specifically, the disruption of Tanaka's convoy delayed the delivery of the heavy artillery pieces that Japanese planning had scheduled for Guadalcanal as part of the initial reinforcement package. Among the stores aboard Kinryu Maru and the other transport ships that didn't reach Guadalcanal on the 24th and the 25th of August were 150mm Tit-96 howitzers. These were siege weapons, effectively artillery capable of reaching Henderson Field from positions in the jungle southwest of the airstrip and reducing the runway surface to craters faster than any repair crew could fill them. They didn't arrive on the 25th. They arrived later in diminished numbers, carried piecemeal by destroyers that couldn't transport more than 1 or 2 pieces per run. The Guadalcanal garrison's artillery, for the subsequent ground offensive, was a fraction of what the original plan had specified. The night bombardments tell the other side of the operational story. Japanese destroyers and cruisers began shelling Henderson Field intermittently starting the night of the 24th into the 25th, continuing through the last days of August and into September. Mikowa's heavy cruisers made a floatplane bombing run against the field on the nights following Eastern Solomons, their aircraft dropping bombs from several thousand FT in darkness with limited accuracy. The physical damage from these bombardments was rarely catastrophic. Henderson Field's runway was pierced steel planking over coral and a shell crater, and pierced steel planking can be repaired in 20 minutes with a work crew and a supply of spare planking sections. But the effect on the maintenance crews and ground personnel was different from the effect on the runway. The mechanics and armament crews who kept the Cactus Air Force operational were working 12 to 18-hour days in tropical heat, sleeping in foxholes, eating captured Japanese rice when American rations were short, and being intermittently shelled at night by warships they couldn't see. The repair times on aircraft lengthened. The judgment calls on whether an aircraft was safe to fly got harder to make under those conditions. The fuel degradation problem, which appears in almost no account of the Cactus Air Force operations, but which the technical records document clearly, compounded the supply shortage. Aviation gasoline stored in steel drums in tropical temperatures loses effective octane rating through thermal cycling over time. The drums at Henderson Field in late August had been sitting in equatorial sun long enough that the fuel they contained was measurably below the 100 octane specification that the F4F Wildcats Pratt & Whitney R280 engine was designed to consume. The practical consequence: the Wildcats were running on fuel that reduced their climbing performance under full throttle by an estimated 6 to 8% compared to the technical specification. For a fighter whose climbing speed was already marginal against Japanese aircraft in a stern chase, that degradation mattered. The Cactus Air Force pilots who complained that their aircraft felt slow in late August weren't imagining things. They were describing the arithmetic of warm drums and compromised fuel. The 1st Marine Aircraft Wing WWII and the intelligence officer's daily situation reports cross-referenced against Comopac's aviation strength returns for the same period produce a persistent discrepancy that tells you something important about institutional communication in this campaign. The Comopac strength returns consistently show higher numbers of aircraft assigned to Henderson field than the WWII's count of operationally ready aircraft. Sometimes the difference was 10 aircraft, sometimes more than 20. The higher number was aircraft nominally assigned, including those awaiting parts, those grounded for maintenance, those with battle damage under repair. The lower number was aircraft that could actually be fueled, armed, and launched within 30 minutes of an alert. The strategic decisions being made at Pearl Harbor and Niue were based on the higher number. The pilots facing incoming Japanese aircraft at dawn were working with the lower one. What saved Henderson Field in the weeks after Eastern Solomons was a combination of factors that don't reduce to any single dramatic narrative. The disrupted Japanese logistics, which slowed the delivery of heavy artillery and reduced the Guadalcanal garrison's combat power below what it needed to overrun the American perimeter. The improvised supply chain, the destroyers, submarines, and by flying boats that kept the fuel drums coming barely in sufficient quantity to keep missions flying. The specific decision made in the days immediately following Eastern Solomons to begin construction of Fighter Strip 1, a second runway southeast of the original Henderson Field strip, shorter and rougher, but usable by fighters, that significantly expanded the Cactus Air Force's capacity and resilience. Fighter Strip 1 was operational by mid-September. It wouldn't have been built in time if the Battle of the Eastern Solomons hadn't bought the days needed to build it. That second runway is among the battle's most tangible and most consistently overlooked material consequences. The operations log entry from the 26th of August, the 17 drums, the 5 missions. The penciled margin note is the document that anchors this chapter for me. Not because it's the most dramatic moment in the Guadalcanal campaign. It isn't. But because it makes viscerally clear what the carrier battle of the 24th had actually produced, and what it had not. It had kept the field in American hands. It had disrupted the Japanese reinforcement timeline sufficiently to prevent the immediate delivery of the weapons that might have closed the runway for good. It had bought time. What it hadn't done was solve the supply problem, or neutralize the rebel air fleet, or repair the drainage channels, or replace the aviation gasoline with anything more than what the improvised logistics chain could deliver drum by drum. The 44 hours of fuel on the morning of August 26 is the honest measure of what the battle's tactical success meant on the ground. It was enough. Barely, contingently, arithmetically enough. Chapter 15. Saratoga. Wounded the missing carrier. The Imperial Japanese Navy Submarine 126 filed her patrol report on the 1st of September, 1942. The relevant entry is timed at 0748 on the 31st of August. It reads in the spare procedural language of a submarine commander recording what he observed. Fleet carrier Saratoga class bearing 0 range 800 meters. Spread of 6 Type 95 torpedoes launched. 1 explosion confirmed. Carrier listing. Executing deep dive. The entry occupies 3 lines. Submarine patrol reports are not written for drama. They're written so that the information they contain can be retrieved and acted upon. What I-26's entry contains in those 3 lines is the eraser of the most important material. Consequence of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. 7 days. That's how long the American tactical victory of August 24th lasted as a strategic reality. 7 days between the battle that preserved Henderson Field and began the attrition of Japanese carrier aircrew and the torpedo that removed from the South Pacific the carrier that had launched the winning strike on Ryujo. The carrier from whose flight deck Frank Jack Fletcher had directed the entire engagement. The carrier whose air group had done more damage to the Japanese force than any other single instrument in the battle. USS Saratoga hit at 0748 on the 31st of August, 1942 by a single Type 95 torpedo from I-26. 1 torpedo. The ship would be under repair at Puget Sound Naval Shipyard for 88 days. The Type 95 was Japan's standard submarine launch torpedo, a 21-inch oxygen-fueled weapon with a warhead of 405 kilograms of Type 97 explosive capable of 51 knots. Its oxygen propulsion derived from the same technical philosophy. as the famous surface launch Type 93 Long Lance left virtually no bubble wake, no visible track of compressed air rising to the surface ahead of the weapon. To give the target warning, the American Mark 114 torpedo of the same period used compressed air propulsion and left a visible bubble trail in good sea conditions. The difference in detectability between the two weapons was real and significant. The lookouts aboard Saratoga's screening destroyers, running a standard anti-submarine pattern around the carrier at what was for 1942. A normal screening distance saw nothing until the explosion. The hit flooded Saratoga's starboard fire room, killed 12 men, and produced a 6-day list that her damage control parties corrected within an hour. She could still steam. She wasn't going to the bottom, but the damage to her engineering plant reduced her to a maximum speed of roughly 13 knots, under her own power, which meant she couldn't conduct flight operations in the light tropical winds of the South Pacific. A carrier needs to make at least 25 knots into the wind to operate aircraft safely. And if the wind isn't providing 15 to 20 of those knots, the ship has to make up the difference with her engines. 13 knots wasn't enough. Saratoga limped toward Tonga under escort, and from Tonga she headed for Puget Sound. And Puget Sound meant 88 days. The strategic arithmetic of what followed is genuinely uncomfortable to work through. Enterprise had been under repair at Pearl Harbor since approximately the 27th of August. Her estimated repair time was 7 weeks. She would return to the South Pacific on the 24th of October. So as of the 31st of August, 1942, the American carrier force in the South Pacific consisted of USS Wasp, which had missed Eastern Solomons while refueling and had returned to the theater, and USS Hornet, which had arrived from the Atlantic in mid-August, to carriers against a Japanese carrier force that, despite its Eastern Solomons losses, still included Shokaku, Zuikaku, the light carrier Ryujo, and the newer carrier Juno. The battle that had been fought on the 24th of August to preserve the American strategic position in the South Pacific had produced a tactical victory that was within 7 days reduced to a carrier defense of everything the battle had been fought to protect. Then on the 15th of September, 1942, 2 weeks after Saratoga's torpedoing, USS Wasp was operating southwest of Guadalcanal when the submarine I-19 fired a spread of 6 torpedoes at her. 3 hit. The fires that followed reached Wasp's aviation gasoline stowage. The resulting explosions were beyond control. 183 men were killed. Wasp sank in approximately 5 hours. I-19's remaining torpedoes from the same spread running past Wasp continued on their track and struck the battleship USS North Carolina and the destroyer O'Brien. North Carolina, though damaged, survived. O'Brien was so severely structurally weakened that she broke apart and sank while attempting a transit to Pearl Harbor for repairs. 1 submarine salvo fired in the space of seconds sank 1 carrier, damaged a battleship, and destroyed a destroyer. Wasp displaced 14,700 tons and carried 76 aircraft and 2,247 crew. Her loss removed from the theater more aircraft than Japan had lost in the entire Battle of the Eastern Solomons. After Wasp went down, USS Hornet was the only operational American carrier in the South Pacific. 1 carrier. Enterprise was still at Pearl Harbor. Saratoga was at Puget Sound. The entire American strategic position in the South Pacific. The position defended at Eastern Solomons at the cost of 90 men, and the carrier's worth of battle damage, rested on a single ship. This is the context in which the tactical success of August 24th needs to be understood. Victory in a carrier battle doesn't confer immunity from submarines. It doesn't guarantee the security of the ships that won the battle. The Eastern Solomons outcome was real and it mattered. And yet within 3 weeks it existed within a strategic framework of such thinness that a single torpedo in the wrong ship on the wrong morning could have ended American carrier operations in the South Pacific entirely. The commanding officer of I-26 through this period was Commander Minoru Yoko, His submarine had found Saratoga not through exceptional intelligence work, or a specifically targeted search. The patrol records suggest it was a routine transit patrol that encountered the carrier task force by chance while covering a standard operational sector. The American task force was not in any meaningful sense operating carelessly. The screening formation was standard. The speed was appropriate for the conditions. The geometry of submarine attack in 1942 was simply such that a skilled commander with a capable weapon in the right ocean sector could find a carrier on any given morning. Without advanced warning, Ryujo attacked and hit. He filed his report in 3 lines. He didn't know and couldn't have known that his single torpedo would change the balance of power in the South Pacific for 3 months. Saratoga returned from Puget Sound in mid-November of 1942, repaired, modernized in her anti-aircraft armament and carrying an air group that had used the 88 days of the repair period for intensive training. She arrived back in the South Pacific in time for the naval battle of Guadalcanal. In mid-November barely. She missed the Battle of Santa Cruz on the 26th of October, at which Hornet was sunk, and Enterprise was damaged again. Enterprise had returned from Pearl Harbor on the 24th of October, 2 days before Santa Cruz, and fought the battle with repairs that were still not fully complete. The carrier force that fought Santa Cruz was Enterprise alone in American hands, plus the newly committed carrier Hornet, and it produced American losses heavier than Eastern Solomons, despite, or partly because of the degraded state of the Japanese air groups that had been worn down since August. Saratoga was 800 miles away, while Hornet burned. If the torpedo had not hit on the 31st of August, if the 88-day repair had not been necessary, Saratoga would have been at Santa Cruz. Hornet might still have been sunk. The battle's dynamics were complex, but the American position would have been considerably stronger. History doesn't run counterfactuals, but the contingency is worth naming precisely because it illustrates how fragile the victories of carrier warfare actually were. The submarine I-26, for what it's worth, went on. She damaged USS Juneau in November of 1942, the ship aboard which the 5 Sullivan brothers from Wartell, Iowa were killed when the cruiser sank in the waters north of Guadalcanal. One submarine operating through the Guadalcanal campaign that had torpedoed Saratoga damaged Juneau, and contributed to the deaths of well over 200 American sailors. She appears in almost no carrier battle history, because submarine operations are categorized separately from surface and air engagements. In the standard historical taxonomy, the taxonomy is convenient for organization. It obscures the operational reality that the waters around Guadalcanal in the late summer and autumn of 1942 were contested at every depth, and that the most consequential single weapons platform in the South Pacific between August and November might have been a submarine rather than a carrier. Chapter 16. What the battle decided and what it didn't. In October of 1945, a team of American interrogators from the United States Strategic Bombing Survey sat across a table from Rear Admiral Yonichi Kusaka, who had commanded the Southeast Area Fleet in 1942 and early 1943, and therefore had a specific operational view of the Guadalcanal campaign from the Japanese side. The interrogators were working through a prepared list of questions about Japanese decision-making during the campaign, and at some point, one of them asked whether the Battle of the Eastern Solomons had been decisive. Kusaka's reply, as transcribed in interrogation number 477, was this: "It was decisive in the way that the first cut of a sword is decisive. It did not end the fight, but it told us something about the blade." The interrogator's follow-up question asked him to elaborate. Kusaka apparently declined, or the transcript simply doesn't record an elaboration. That single metaphor, standing alone in the record, is the most honest strategic summary of Eastern Solomons I found in any primary source, from either side. The formal scorecard of the battle is unambiguous in its directional conclusion. Ships sunk. Japan lost the light carrier Ryujo, the destroyer Mutsuki, and the transport King Umaru. The United States lost no ships, aircraft destroyed. Japan lost 75 aircraft, counting all types from all locations, including land-based and floatplanes. The United States lost 20 aircraft from all causes across both days of the engagement. Aircrew killed. Japan lost 61 experienced carrier aviators. The United States lost 7 troops delivered to Guadalcanal by the Japanese Reinforcement Convoy 0. Henderson Field's operational status at the end of the engagement fully functional. By every quantifiable metric, this was an American victory. Richard Frank's conclusion in Guadalcanal, his 1990 history of the campaign, is direct on the point. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons was unquestionably an American victory. He's not wrong. What Frank also notes immediately following that sentence is the qualification that every honest assessment of Eastern Solomons has to carry. But it had little long-term result apart from a further reduction in the corps of trained Japanese carrier aviators. The reinforcements that could not come by slow transport would soon reach Guadalcanal by other means. This is the exact analytical tension that the battle presents. The metrics of the engagement are American. The immediate strategic consequence, the disruption of Tanaka's convoy, the preservation of Henderson Field, the further degradation of J in carrier aircrew are American. And yet, the battle didn't end the campaign. It didn't prevent the Tokyo Express. It didn't stop the land battles that would consume Guadalcanal for another 5.5 months. It won something real and failed to be decisive in the way that Midway fought just 10 weeks earlier is broadly understood to have been decisive. How do you calibrate a victory that was genuine but incomplete? Samuel Eliot Morison, writing in 1958 in the 5th volume of his Naval Operations History, characterized Eastern Solomons as tactically important but strategically inconclusive. He was writing with access to operational records, but also with the filter of a historiographical tradition that measured Pacific battles against Midway's dramatic clarity, 4 carriers in one afternoon, and found most of them somewhat wanting by comparison. The problem with measuring Eastern Solomons against Midway is that they were structurally different kinds of engagements, producing structurally different kinds of consequences. Midway was a decisive battle in the classical sense. Both sides committed fully, one side lost catastrophically, and the immediate material result was so one-sided that the strategic implications were visible within days. Eastern Solomons was a nutritional battle, one installment in a much longer accounting ledger whose consequences accumulated over months. Rather than announcing themselves in an afternoon smoke, applying the Midway template to Eastern Solomons and finding it inconclusive is a bit like applying the criteria for a knockout to a fight that was decided on points. The aircrew mathematics looked at in the context of the full Guadalcanal campaign, rather than in isolation, is where Eastern Solomons becomes most clearly significant. 61 experienced Japanese carrier aviators killed in a single afternoon, at the JN's pre-war production rate of roughly 100 to 150 carrier-qualified pilots per year, replacing those 61 men with equivalent experience required between 5 and 7 months of training program output. Assuming the entire output went to replacing Eastern Solomons losses and nothing else, that assumption was impossible to meet because the Guadalcanal campaign's land-based air operations were simultaneously consuming rebel-based aircrew at a rate that created its own replacement demand. The 61 men lost on the 24th of August were not replaced with equivalent quality by the time Shokaku and Zuikaku returned for Santa Cruz in October. They were replaced numerically with pilots who averaged fewer than 300 flight hours, who had qualified on carrier decks in calm waters rather than combat operations, and who knew how to fly their aircraft, but hadn't yet developed the intuitive spatial judgment that makes the difference between a near miss and a hit in a 70 dive at terminal velocity. The Japanese are overcounting. The pilot reports that described 2 American carriers sunk when one was damaged, that claimed USS Hornet destroyed when Hornet was 600 meters away, had its own contribution to the battle's ultimate strategic significance, because Japanese command believed they had won a larger victory than they had. The strategic planning for the Guadalcanal campaign in September and October of 1942 proceeded on assumptions about American carrier strength that were incorrect. The campaign continued to be pressed with a level of strategic commitment that a more accurate damage assessment might have caused headquarters to reconsider. More troops were sent by the Express. More air attacks were launched from Rebel. More naval resources were committed to a campaign whose underlying logistics, once the transport ships had been rendered inoperable, were structurally inadequate to support a successful land offensive. The Japanese fought the Guadalcanal campaign to its conclusion with a ferocity and commitment that the historical record makes clear, and they lost it. The Eastern Solomons overcounting is one of the threads in that outcome. There is a specific event from the 25th of August that deserves to be placed at the center of any strategic assessment of this battle, and that most accounts treat as a footnote. The 4 B-17 heavy bombers from Espiritu Santo that sank the destroyer Mutsuki, while she was stopped alongside the transport Kinryumaru rescuing survivors. This event, which took perhaps 10 minutes and involved no carrier aircraft and no fleet action, convinced Admiral Tanaka, and through him the operational command structure of the 8th Fleet that day, light surface transit to Guadalcanal was no longer viable. Tanaka didn't reach this conclusion because of the carrier battle. He reached it because of what happened to a stationary destroyer in daylight, within range of high-altitude bombers based several hundred miles away. The implication was clear. Any Japanese surface vessel that slowed, stopped, or operated in predictable patterns within Henderson Field striking range during daylight hours was at serious risk from the combined air threat centered on the island. The convoy system died not at 16:29 on the 24th when the first bombs hit Enterprise, but at around 083 on the 25th when Mutsuki's crew watched B-17's approach from altitude and had nowhere to go. Kusaka's sword metaphor is the most honest framing available. The first cut told both sides something about the blade, about how sharp American carrier air power and Henderson Field's combined air threat had become, about how fragile the JN's air crew replacement pipeline was, about how exposed a conventional Japanese convoy was to land-based air attack. Within the operational radius of Guadalcanal, it didn't end the fight. The fight had 23 more weeks to run, and it would produce battles larger in immediate destructiveness than Eastern Solomons. The naval battle of Guadalcanal in November, the attrition of the Tokyo Express runs, the slow grinding of the ground campaign. But the first cut was real, the blade was real, and everything that followed was, in ways both direct and indirect, shaped by what the 24th of August revealed about what each side was actually capable of, and what each side could actually sustain. Chapter 17. The Inheritance of the Eastern Solomons. On the 15th of September, 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz at CPC Pearl Harbor signed a memorandum that ran to 9 pages. It was an after-action analysis of the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the kind of systematic institutional document that the United States Navy, even in the middle of a war, consistently produced and circulated through its command structure. Page 3, Item 7 reads as follows. Fighter direction at Eastern Solomons demonstrated both the potential and the critical limitations of radar-directed air defense. Recommend immediate review of FDO procedures, voice radio channel allocation and if synchronization protocols. The next carrier battle will be fought differently. He was right. The Battle of Santa Cruz, fought on the 26th of October, 1942, was fought with improved fighter direction procedures, revised if synchronization, and a revised channel allocation that gave the fighter director officer a dedicated circuit, separate from the general combat air patrol frequency. Enterprise was hit again at Santa Cruz, but the fighter direction system worked better than it had worked on the 24th of August, and the difference was traceable to those 9 pages. The doctrinal changes that came directly from Eastern Solomons are not individually dramatic, but their cumulative weight is substantial. The prohibition on open ready service ammunition storage during aircraft alerts, written after 35 men died in Enterprise's Gun Gallery 3 because powder charges were in open trays, rather than closed lockers. The revised Kota flooding protocol that specified confirmed cleared space requirements before flooding an enclosed space written because 2 men died of asphyxiation in the gun gallery firefighting operation, and the existing protocol hadn't adequately addressed the confirmation requirement. The updated counter-flooding weight distribution procedure that formalized what Lieutenant Commander Herschel Smith's teams had performed under improvised conditions during the damage control operation. Each of these changes appears in subsequent editions of the relevant technical manuals, without reference to their origin. They're just the standard. The standard exists because of what happened aboard Enterprise on the 24th of August, 1942. The radar development trajectory is the most technically significant institutional consequence of the battle, and it followed the specific path that Nimitz's page 3 recommendation pointed toward. The CX-1 radar's fundamental limitation, it produced a two-dimensional plot with no altitude data, was the single most operationally consequential technical shortcoming identified in the Eastern Solomons after-action analysis. Without altitude data, the fighter director officer couldn't give his Wildcats precise intercept vectors. Without precise intercept vectors, fighters reached the attack formation late at wrong altitudes and without the geometric advantage needed for effective interception. The Bureau of Ships Development record shows accelerated procurement and testing of the Swan Height Finding Radar, a system specifically designed to add the altitude dimension missing from the CX-AM-1. Following the Eastern Solomons analysis, the SM-1 was operational on fleet carriers by early 1943. It directly improved fighter direction effectiveness at subsequent carrier engagements. The CX-1's bedspring antenna staring at the empty ocean north of Santa Isabel Island on the 24th of August and showing Japanese dive bombers as a flat dot on a two-dimensional scope was a direct cause of a specific procurement decision that changed the operational performance of American carrier air defense within 6 months. There is something quietly worth examining in the fact that the CX-1 was built on a Yogi Uda antenna design, developed by the Japanese physicist Hidetsugu Yogi in 1926. Scientific knowledge crosses borders. Military application doesn't. The antenna architecture that tracked incoming Japanese aircraft toward Enterprise on the 24th of August had its conceptual roots in Japanese physics, was commercialized and adapted by American engineers, and was then used to defend an American carrier against attack by the nation whose scientific tradition had partly enabled it. This isn't an irony to overload with significance. It's simply what the history of military technology looks like when you follow it carefully. Messy, borrowed, international in its foundations and fiercely national in its application. The training system consequences of Eastern Solomons played out more slowly than the radar procurement decisions, but they were in the longer arc of the Pacific War at least as significant. The 61 Japanese carrier air crew killed on the 24th of August were part of the body of evidence that the JN's Bureau of Aeronautics presented to Combined Fleet Headquarters in late 1942, when arguing for an expansion of the pilot training program. The expansion was approved and initiated, smaller than needed, later than necessary, but real. The post-war USBS, Japan's struggle to end the war, documents the expansion decision and its rationale, which included explicit reference to the Guadalcanal campaign's aircrew attrition. Eastern Solomons losses were among the cited evidence. The training expansion that resulted was insufficient to reverse the trend. By the time expanded program graduates were reaching fleet units in 1943 and 1944, the experienced core of the pre-war and early war cadre was already reduced beyond recovery. But the institutional decision to expand training, delayed and inadequate as it was triggered in part by exactly what happened north of Santa Isabel Island on a single afternoon. The American side's training consequences were different in character, because the American training expansion had already begun before Eastern Solomons. The Naval Aviation Cadet Program expanded under legislation passed in 1939 and 1940. was already producing pilots at rates the pre-war program hadn't approached by the time of the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June of 1944. The engagement American aviators called the Marianas Turkey Shoot. The United States had roughly 15,000 carrier-qualified aviators in the fleet. Japan had rebuilt its carrier air groups with pilots whose average flight hours were a fraction of the Eastern Solomons veterans they were replacing. The gap between the two forces at the Philippine Sea was not the product of any single decision or any single battle. It was the accumulated result of two navies making different institutional choices about training investment across 3 years of war, with the Eastern Solomons attrition as one of the inflection points along that diverging path. Enterprise survived the Guadalcanal campaign. She survived Santa Cruz, damaged again, but operational. She survived the Philippine Sea and Lee Gulf and the Okinawa campaign, during which a kamikaze hit her forward elevator and put her briefly out of action. For the last time, she finished the war as the most decorated United States warship in the conflict's history. 20 battle stars earned across 4 years of combat, a record no other American ship has matched before or since. She was decommissioned in February of 1947, redesignated for administrative purposes through the 1950s, and despite extensive and genuine public campaigns to preserve her as a museum ship, campaigns backed by veterans organizations, newspaper editorial boards, and several members of Congress, she was sold for scrapping in July of 1958. The last physical structure from USS Enterprise was demolished in 1960. She doesn't exist anywhere you can go to see her. The most decorated warship in American naval history is a name on a building and a set of photographs in an archive. I thought about this a good deal while working through the materials for this documentary, and I want to be honest about what I make of it. The decision to scrap Enterprise was partly financial. Museum ship preservation is expensive, and the immediate post-war period wasn't flushed with money. For historical sentiment, and partly a reflection of a military culture that in 1958 was looking forward toward nuclear carriers and jet aircraft rather than backward toward a ship that had fought with propeller aircraft and steam catapults. The argument against preservation was that Enterprise was obsolete technology, that her design was superseded, that the lessons she embodied were embedded in the ships that succeeded her rather than in her hull. That argument was probably correct in its practical engineering assessment. It was wrong in its understanding of what a physical artifact does that a doctrine manual cannot. When you read the Bureau of Ships War Damage Report for Enterprise, the actual document, not a summary of it, and you follow the structural diagram annotations through the sections on the armored hangar deck, and the void tank compartmentalization and the pre-staged planking repair protocol, you're reading something that exists because a specific ship was hit by specific bombs at a specific place in time and survived in ways that taught specific people specific things. The knowledge in those pages was purchased. The ship that was the instrument of that purchase, the vessel whose structural integrity proved the design assumptions of engineers who'd worked 30 years earlier, was cut apart in a New Jersey shipyard and sold by the ton. The doctrine it generated is still in the manual. The ship it came from is gone. The Battle of the Eastern Solomons itself occupies an unusual position in the popular memory of the Pacific War, which is to say, it occupies almost none. Ask a reasonably well-read person to name the major carrier battles of the Second World War, and you'll get Coral Sea, Midway, and perhaps Santa Cruz or the Philippine Sea. Eastern Solomons is routinely omitted, or noted briefly as a minor action between the famous ones. This omission has a logic to it. The battle didn't have Midway's dramatic finality. It didn't have Coral Sea's narrative arc of mutual damage and mutual withdrawal. It didn't have the Philippine Sea's one-sided statistics. What it had was functional significance. The kind of significance that operates through logistics disruption and aircrew attrition, and doctrinal revision, and a runway extension on a jungle island. The kind of significance that doesn't photograph well, and doesn't reduce to a single memorable moment. Fighter Strip 1. The second runway at Henderson Field, the construction decision made in the days immediately after Eastern Solomons bought enough time to make building it possible, was operational by mid-September of 1942. It expanded the Cactus Air Force's capacity significantly, providing a dedicated fighter strip that reduced the runway congestion that had been a persistent operational problem when bombers and fighters shared a single strip. By October of 1942, the two-trip complex at Lunga Point was operating more than 100 aircraft. The specific decision to build Fighter Strip 1 was made because the Eastern Solomons battle had bought the days needed to build it. That second runway is the battle's most physically tangible strategic legacy, and it appears in almost no account of the engagement. It's in the Marine Corps' engineering records. It's in the First Marine Aircraft Wing War Diary. It's in the surveys the Navy conducted of Guadalcanal's air facilities after the campaign ended. It's just not in the narrative because runways being built are considerably less cinematic than carriers burning. The Guadalcanal campaign ended on the 9th of February 1943, when the last Japanese troops were evacuated from Cape Esperance in a night operation, so well executed that American forces didn't realize it had happened until the following morning. 6 months after the 1st Marine Division landed on Guadalcanal, the island was American. The airfield that had been a Japanese construction project in early August of 1942, that the Marines had seized and extended with a captured road roller, that had been defended at the cost of a carrier battle and a 6-month ground campaign, was Henderson Field, the air hub from which the Allied advance up the Solomons chain would proceed step by step toward Rabaul and beyond. The battle for Guadalcanal was one of the central campaigns of the Pacific War, and its outcome shaped everything that followed in the Central and Southwestern Pacific for the next 2.5 years. Eastern Solomons sits inside that campaign as what Shokaku called a first cut, a blow that told both sides something about the blade. It told the Japanese that conventional convoy operations to Guadalcanal within Henderson Field striking range were over, forcing the adoption of the Tokyo Express and all the strategic consequences that flowed from that improvisation. It told American carrier commanders that radar-directed fighter defense was viable, but technically immature, triggering the doctrinal and procurement changes that produced meaningfully better performance at subsequent engagements. It reduced the JA's experienced carrier aircrew cadre by 61 irreplaceable men, one installment in the attrition payments that eventually made the Philippines' outcome possible. It preserved Henderson Field for one more day, and then one more week, and then long enough to build a second runway. None of these consequences announced themselves cleanly on the afternoon of the 24th of August. They accumulated in maintenance records, training reports, construction logs, and operational diaries written by men who were mostly too tired and too busy to know. They were recording consequences. That's how history actually works. Not in the dramatic moments, though there were dramatic moments. In the 17 drums of fuel, in the pre-cut lumber in the hangar bay, in the penstroke on a navigational chart at 2,350 that turned a fleet away from a battle. It could have won. The waters north of Santa Isabel Island are warm and deep and empty of any visible record of what happened there. The carriers are all gone. Ryujo to the bottom. Enterprise to a New Jersey shipyard. Saratoga to nuclear weapons testing at Bikini Atoll in 1946. Shokaku to an American submarine in 1944. Zuikaku to American carrier aircraft at Copiao in October of 1944. The men are mostly gone too through old age if not through the war itself, though some of them gave testimony to historians, and left records that survive them in archives in Washington and Tokyo and Annapolis. What remains is the doctrine, the radar architecture, the runway, the institutional sediment of a battle that nobody fully planned and nobody completely won, and nobody who was there ever entirely forgot. Shokaku was right about the first cut. He was right that it told something about the blade. What he perhaps didn't fully anticipate, sitting across from American interrogators in October of 1945, was how much the blade had learned from making